Giant, city-crushing, awe-inspiring monsters. They're a facet of global pop culture, beloved by audiences around the world. Behemoths of unimaginable size and power, blazing a trail of destruction and mayhem in their path. From the movie theaters to television screens and even video game consoles and literature, giant monsters are everywhere. There are so many different types of giant monster, but only one specific one rises above the rest when it comes to global recognition. Kaiju. A word most people have probably heard thrown around when discussing these types of disaster stories, but what exactly are kaiju? What does this term mean? In a most literal sense, the word kaiju is a Japanese word roughly translating to strange beast, and is used to describe, well, giant monsters. Whether it be from movies, TV shows, comic books, etc., it's affixed to almost any type of big, nasty creature. But let's think for a second. It's a distinctly Japanese word, and yet we use it in our English dialogue to describe a phenomenon that spans around the world. Why is that? Well, that's the subject of this documentary. A deep dive into the history of the kaiju genre, its roots in Japanese and American culture, and the distinctive attributes that encompass all entries in its index. Consider this a crash course, if you will, on KAIJUOLOGY. The origins of the kaiju genre are steeped in the history of Japan as a country itself. But before we dive into the historical aspects of kaiju, it's important that we identify just what exactly we're talking about here. As mentioned in the preamble, kaiju is a distinctly Japanese term. The country is probably the most important factor to consider here. The origins of the kaiju genre lie in Japan, full stop. When talking about kaiju films, characters like Godzilla, Gamera, Mothra, King Ghidorah all come to mind immediately. It would stand to reason then that kaiju movies are only Japanese productions, right? Well, not necessarily. In Japan, kaiju is used for pretty much any sort of giant monster. The four mentioned before, but also King Kong, the Cloverfield monster, the beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and even the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man are considered kaiju in Japan. But again, in Japan. Outside of Japan, it wouldn't really make much sense to use a Japanese term to describe something that's not distinctly Japanese, right? For example, anime. When that's mentioned, you know what type of media it's referring to. In Japan, though, it's not just that. It can range anywhere from Japanese-produced shows like Demon Slayer, Gurren Lagann, or Neon Genesis Evangelion, to Western animated series like SpongeBob SquarePants, Ben 10, or even Ren and Stimpy. But in America, we wouldn't call the latter anime, right? Well, unironically at least. So bringing it back to kaiju then, it wouldn't really make much sense to use a Japanese term to describe something without any Japanese influence, right? With that in mind, we can then identify the first factor we will use to describe kaiju. A kaiju is distinctly Japanese, or is directly inspired by some aspect of Japanese culture. Cloverfield, to use an earlier example, is deeply rooted in American sensibilities and overt themes, but its main inspiration was producer J.J. Abrams wanting the United States to have a monster similar to Japan's Godzilla. And that anecdote is a good segue towards the second identifiable attribute for a kaiju film. To use the big G as another example, what exactly is it that makes Godzilla so predominantly prevalent in pop culture? No doubt the movies themselves are a joy to watch, but why did Godzilla stand out among the rest and become a household name? Well, it's because Godzilla is more than just a big dinosaur destroying cities. Godzilla himself is a distinct character. Kaiju have individual personalities, or characters, that portray them as more than just giant obstacles. In most giant monster pictures, especially those produced in Hollywood during the 1950s and 60s atomic age of cinema, the creatures are not portrayed as anything beyond big, snarling menaces to the protagonists, challenges to be overcome by simple brute force. With kaiju, the monsters require more intelligence and cunning strategy to be overcome, and are treated and billed on the same level as the actors surrounding them. When talking about personality, it can be more than just a set of emotional characteristics. It's also most certainly reflected in the kaiju's physical design as well. For example, Kumonga, a spider kaiju, is for the most part just a giant menacing arachnid, but there are distinct design philosophies and attributes that set it apart from other big bugs like those in the American film Tarantula or Earth vs. the Spider. There's a picture that occasionally makes the rounds on social media, a kaiju alignment chart that tries to categorize the definition of kaiju using a basis of scale and origin. While funny, this chart is also extremely problematic for multiple reasons. One, as some Twitter users have pointed out, it essentially commits a linguistic faux pas, allowing the definition of a specifically coined term to be expanded into plain absurdity. For those language anarchists out there who love to mess around with words and try to find new ways to interpret and use them, more power to you. The field of linguistics is genuinely intriguing, but this sort of devil-may-care approach also makes discussing a definitively provable genre and its umbrella of media very messy and disorganized. The two attributes laid out in this segment serve to condense and identify the actual recognizable elements of kaiju media in order to give a proper history of the genre itself. So if you want to call Clifford the Big Red Dog a kaiju, by all means go for it, but we won't be doing that in this documentary. So now that the term kaiju has been defined, a Japanese or Japanese-inspired giant monster with a distinct personality and or character that portrays them as more than just a giant obstacle, we can finally begin to discuss the actual history of the genre itself, beginning with the proto-kaiju era spanning 1925 to 1953. As mentioned before, kaiju are rooted in the history of Japan itself. We won't go into the wartime history of Japan and the post-war period, as those are topics far too lengthy for a project of this scope. If you're interested in a more nuanced, intelligent, and well-crafted approach to these points of history, check out Kyodai Kino's From Nagasaki to 9/11 video essay, which covers them and more in fantastic detail, one of the best videos out there on the kaiju genre. Suffice to say, World War II and the fallout from that had a profound impact on Japanese culture, especially the world of Japanese film. But even during and before the war itself, the groundwork for the kaiju genre was being laid surprisingly not in Japan, but in the Western world. 1925 saw the release of an important film in Hollywood history, Hario Hoyt's The Lost World, based on Arthur Conan Doyle's 1912 novel. The story is of a lost expedition to a forgotten peninsula in Central America, where prehistoric creatures roam in modern times. The Lost World was not the first theatrical film to feature dinosaurs, and it certainly wasn't the first to feature a giant creature of any kind, but it was, at the time, the biggest success of a monster-related film since the beginning of cinema. Most of this can be attributed to the pioneering stop-motion animation effects work by industry legend Willis H. O'Brien. A cartoonist turned boxer turned marble sculptor, O'Brien had always held a lifelong fascination with prehistoric creatures, and during his time as a sculptor, would make miniature cavemen and dinosaur figurines with which he'd animate short features showcasing his animation prowess. O'Brien was hired to work visual effects on a number of shorts before being recruited to work on The Lost World. And as the domino effect of the film industry is one to be, The Lost World got O'Brien work at RKO Pictures, attempting to finance and produce Creation, a sort of follow-up to The Lost World that unfortunately never got off the ground. But what Creation did provide for O'Brien was the chance to cement his legacy as the creator and helmsman of one of the most iconic screen creatures of all time. RKO's 1933 seminal classic King Kong needs no introduction. One of the greatest adventure films of all time and a true pioneering piece in motion picture history, not just for its groundbreaking technical work, but also for other introductions, such as the first full-length musical score for a film. The giant ape picture was the brainchild of producers Marion Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack, who had a knack for making bigger-than-life safari and adventure pictures before settling work on Kong. King Kong's stop-motion effects were a natural progression for Willis O'Brien's work, and the absolute peak of his career as an artist. Kong himself is one of the most expressive monster characters of the golden age of film. O'Brien's phenomenal animating skills showcasing the character's brutish yet sympathetic personality. You might be able to see where we're going with this. The Lost World and King Kong, by our definitions, are not exactly kaiju films. The dinosaurs in the former are simple animals living their lives normally, and aside from the inaccurate reconstructions of the time, are not depicted as monstrous. Even the rampaging sauropod in London at the end of the film is just a confused individual thrust out of its natural habitat. Kong, however, is a little bit more of a difficult case. The monster is definitely a kaiju with the aforementioned personality, and even instances uttered throughout the film of his being more than just a big ape, with the only snafu really being his lack of a Japanese origin or influence. But the original King Kong was undeniably an influence on the creation of Godzilla, with the film's 1952 re-release in Japan sparking discussion among Toho executives, most notably producer Tomoyuki Tanaka, about the possibility of creating a monster film of their own. And of course, Kong himself eventually became inseparable from Godzilla, appearing in 2 major blockbuster crossover features, and both characters are synonymous with each other in popular culture. By all accounts, Kong is something of a grandfathered-in kaiju. His film of origin doesn't fit the definition, but his inspiration, contributions, and appearances in a vast assortment of kaiju media are enough for us to let it slip by. Of course, The Lost World and King Kong were not the only proto-kaiju inspirations for the genre. It would be very remiss of this section not to talk about the 1953 American monster film, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, probably the most direct inspiration for the original Godzilla. The film concerns the typical atomic monster tropes of the time. A beast is awakened in the Arctic from a nuclear weapons test and comes ashore to New York City, causing chaos and mayhem. Some may be quick to label the titular beast a kaiju itself, and this is another case where it's difficult to disagree. Again, lacking the direct Japanese influences, the beast itself is a giant fictional species of dinosaur, a Rhedosaurus, and while it does act more animalistic than characters like Kong or Godzilla, its design does more than enough to imbue it with a distinct character and personality. Plus, the inclusion of, albeit minor references to the monster's radioactive history and presence does do enough to lend it a sort of allegorical nature, something the Godzilla series and future Japanese monster films would take in extreme stride. One more important film to mention out of the proto-kaiju era would be The Great Buddha Arrival from 1934. This one is explicitly not a kaiju film. The titular Buddha is neither a menace nor a monster, but it is important as one of the first Japanese films to feature tokusatsu filmmaking. Tokusatsu is another Japanese term that loosely translates to special effects, and is primarily used to describe live-action Japanese media that make heavy use of practical, optical, or other types of visual effects in their filming. The Great Buddha Arrival is sadly a lost film, most likely due to the fire bombings of Tokyo in World War II, and not much is really known about it, but it was important to mention as tokusatsu filmmaking would become a hallmark identifier for nearly all of the kaiju genre, from its beginning to the present day. The proto-kaiju era is often overlooked when discussing the history of the kaiju genre. At most, a few mentions of King Kong or the Beast are thrown in, but the greater development of special effects photography doesn't usually receive notice. The Lost World may not be a kaiju film, but without it, we wouldn't have Kong, much less Godzilla. The Great Buddha Arrival may be a footnote in Japanese film history, but regardless, it was one of the first of its kind, and recognizing that is important. Factors from every one of these 4 films melted together to create the perfect mixture to form the kaiju genre as we know it today. Special effects-focused spectacle from films like The Lost World and The Great Buddha Arrival melded with the dynamic monster characters of Kong and the Rhedosaurus, and the fallout from which, in 1954, would result in the true birth of the kaiju genre. The year of 1954 would see 2 major events that would lead to the birth of the world's first true kaiju film. The first was the failure of Japanese film studio Toho to secure financing for In the Shadow of Glory, a planned co-production with Indonesian studio Perfini. Toho producer Tomoyuki Tanaka had flown to Jakarta to negotiate with the studio's representatives, leaving the country without a deal made and a picture in limbo. Flying over the Pacific Ocean, he meditated on another major event that had stricken all of Japan: the final, deadly voyage of the fishing trawler Daigo Fukudomaru, the Lucky Dragon No. 5. The tuna boat and its hapless crew, hauling a cache of recently caught fish, had strayed too close to an American nuclear weapons test at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The sailors were stricken with fallout from the bomb, developing acute radiation syndrome for a number of weeks after their encounter. Upon returning from Japan, the crew were treated for their sickness and a wide-stricken panic broke out in the country over the possibility of contaminated fish in the market. Tanaka combined Japan's contemporary concern over radiation with the recently released and successful monster flick The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, writing an outline for a potential project on the flight. Upon returning to Tokyo, Tanaka presented the idea to Toho executives and it was given the green light. Project G, as it was known at the time, was shrouded in mystery, quickly gathering numerous studio talent such as director Ishiro Honda and special effects craftsman Eiji Tsuburaya. The rest, as they say, is history. Godzilla, released November 3rd, 1954, was and is the first ever true-blood kaiju film. Far different from other monster movies of its time, Godzilla was somber, cynical, and portrayed with a sense of realism for its fantastical events. It's been analyzed hundreds of times, each discovering and presenting new interpretations of its thematic content, but the most apparent and direct allegories are of nuclear weapons and the horrors of war. Godzilla itself is a metaphor for the atomic bomb, a walking engine of destruction turning a civilized nation into rubble with impossibly strong resistance. The images of Tokyo aflame call to mind the fire bombings of the city during the Second World War. Passerbys on trains before Godzilla's first appearance lament having to return to shelters and expressing disbelief at avoiding Hiroshima and Nagasaki only to be in the path of another threat. This thematic resonance with Japanese audiences, coupled with awe-inspiring special effects from Tsuburaya and his crew, bolstered Godzilla to resounding success. Honda, Tanaka, and Tsuburaya had created a new type of monster, one that would spawn imitators for decades to come, and most importantly, the first era of the kaiju genre. Named after the reign of Emperor Hirohito from 1926 to his death in 1989, the Showa era of the kaiju genre is often considered the golden age among scholars and fans. Reasonably considered to have taken place from 1954 to 1981, the Showa era is often cited for its sheer scope of productions from all sorts of different studios, both at home in Japan and overseas. This is the era in which the kaiju boom originates, a period of time in the mid-1960s in which every major Japanese studio had a kaiju-related project in the works. This era also saw the rise of television programming in Japan, which would usher in a new type of kaiju media around the same time as the boom. From a technical viewpoint, the Showa era is identified by its origins in classic Hollywood filmmaking and its natural evolution over the course of 3 decades, beginning with black and white noir-styled pictures, transitioning to full-color scope spectacles with new wave elements in the 1960s, and ending in far-out exploitative productions in the late 70s to the very early 80s. Thematically, the early years of the Showa era featured films heavily influenced by the post-war period, before losing the grimmer war elements in favor of exploration of international cooperation and inspirations from the space age, including alien invaders and faraway planets to explore. The era's twilight years focused heavily on youth culture, from young children to young adults, pouncing on then-current trends and topics such as pollution and violence. Because of this wide berth of cultural history to capitalize on, the Showa era is often regarded as a period of unbridled creativity in both monster design and story beats. Kaiju looks ranged from conservative yet appealing beasts like Gorosaurus, Yongary, and Gomora, to more unusual and alien-looking creatures like King Ghidorah, Gigan, or Doragori, and even extremely far-out and inspired creations like Euron and Mukadendar. Scale is another factor often neglected when discussing the Showa era. Being created in an age before enormous skyscrapers were a common sight in most cities, Showa-era kaiju are often designed at a smaller size, usually around 40 to 60 meters tall. This allowed for the tokusatsu miniature sets and cities to be designed with a higher grade of detail, adding to their realism. The success of the original Godzilla proved to Toho that they had a viable character on their hands, and quickly began work on a sequel. Godzilla Raids Again, released a little under a year later in April of 1955, is not nearly as strong of a picture as the original Godzilla, but still features significant developments for both the genre its predecessor originated and for the title character itself. Raids Again was the first Godzilla film to feature an enemy monster to combat Godzilla himself, a trademark of the kaiju genre as a whole. Introduced here is Anguirus, a quadrupedal, spiny-backed dinosaur monster. Like Godzilla, Anguirus is an amalgamation of various real-life dinosaur species, most notably the Ankylosaurus. The battles between Godzilla and Anguirus are far more animalistic, bringing to mind earlier monster picture showdowns such as Kong battling the Meat Eater in his original film. Despite its less effective production value, most likely due to the absence of the original director Ishiro Honda, Godzilla Raids Again proved to be a considerable success, bolstering the name of Godzilla far beyond what it had reached before, all the way over the Pacific Ocean to the land of Hollywood. In 1956, American audiences most likely didn't expect to be thrilled and charmed by a film not made in their native language. Thus, after purchasing Godzilla's American distribution rights, Trans World Releasing and Embassy Pictures would extensively re-edit the film by inserting American actor Raymond Burr into scenes from the original story. Though Burr's performance in the film is quite good, and the steps taken to keep most of the film's general integrity intact through minimal instances of dubbing succeed, Godzilla King of the Monsters, as it was retitled, stripped away a lot of the allegorical narrative functions of the original Japanese film, reorganizing and advertising it as more of a shock spectacle like most monster movies made in the United States. And unfortunately, this approach would become the norm for most Japanese kaiju productions making their way overseas, an insistence on stripping away the cultural and thematic angles of the films through rigorous dubbing, restructuring, or additions of American actors for marquee value. Back in Japan, Toho was hard at work keeping the kaiju flame alive with yearly releases of tokusatsu features, almost all featuring some sort of giant monster. While Godzilla was in hiatus, Toho experimented with original ideas, although in a case of irony, these films would later on become integrated in some manner into the Godzilla franchise. Films like Rodan, Mothra, and Varan kept the focus squarely on the kaiju themselves, while broader-scoped pictures like The Mysterians and The Three Treasures did feature kaiju in throwaway roles, usually at the request of Toho producers who knew that the beasties were bringing in the big box office bucks. Most of these films, kaiju or otherwise, would feature a recurring group of Godzilla alumni, from actors such as Akira Takarada and Takashi Shimura, to crew members such as director Ishiro Honda, writers Shinichi Sekizawa and Shigeru Kayama, musical composers Akira Ifukube and Masaru Sato, special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya, and monster stunt performer Haruo Nakajima, actor for the original Godzilla. All were overseen by Tomoyuki Tanaka, predominantly securing a seat on the Mount Rushmore of the kaiju genre. Through their popularity and success in theaters worldwide, the casts and crews for these tokusatsu productions firmly cemented Toho Studios as the premier kaiju production studio for the Showa era. Godzilla's 6-year absence from the silver screen would come to an end in the all-out kaiju epic of 1962, King Kong vs. Godzilla. Securing the rights to the giant gorilla from RKO Pictures and Universal, Toho went about putting their monstrous success story against the all-time heavyweight champion of monster lovers worldwide. The idea for Kong battling Godzilla didn't appear out of thin air, though. The concept originated with Kong animator Willis O'Brien, who had been pitching a follow-up to the 1933 classic involving Kong battling a Frankenstein-type monster made from the parts of various African animals. Independent film producer John Beck shopped O'Brien's idea around to various studios, including Toho, who purchased the rights to Kong, but neglected to follow the original story treatment, instead choosing to pit Kong against Godzilla instead. Unfortunately, O'Brien would not receive any credit or compensation for the final product, and he passed away shortly after it premiered in 1962. Although positioned in advertising as a kaiju bout for the ages, King Kong vs. Godzilla would follow a similar allegorical beat to other science fiction pieces directed by Ishiro Honda and written by Shinichi Sekizawa. The film is an abject parody of the entire ordeal, satirizing both the capitalistic nature of such a production, as well as the salaryman comedy subgenre popular in Japan at the time. Though King Kong vs. Godzilla is at its very deepest part a comedy, it still manages to provide spectacle and tension through its monster sequences. The concept is the parody, not the situations. As per the contract signed by Toho, John Beck would retain the international distribution rights to the film outside of Asian countries, and thinking that the comedic style of Toho's film wouldn't play well with English audiences, sought to put the film through the same old ringer as the original Godzilla, inserting scenes of American actors narrating the situation and negating the film's intentional comedic nature in favor of a more bog-standard monster action film. But despite Beck and Toho's differences in the handling of the picture, King Kong vs. Godzilla would prove to be an astounding success. In Japan, the film still holds the all-time attendance record for a Godzilla film, and was re-released several times during the Showa era. In the United States, the film's widespread mass marketing campaign could be held partially responsible for supplanting the character of Godzilla into the consciousness of Americans nationwide. Indeed, the US was going through its own period of monster madness at the time, thanks in no small part to the recent televised airings of the classic Universal horror films from the 1930s and 40s, which captured the imaginations of audiences who may not have been alive during the film's original releases. Godzilla and King Kong slot in right alongside Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman in all sorts of American monster-related merchandise and media. Monster-focused magazines such as Famous Monsters of Filmland prominently featured Godzilla on covers and in articles inside. Model makers would issue plastic recreations of the King of Monsters in the same line as the Prince of Darkness and the Eighth Wonder of the World. Godzilla, for the most part, had planted the idea of kaiju films firmly into the mainstream pop culture. This resurgence of monsters and the rise of a new type of genre to American audiences would prompt Studio King Brothers, who had released Toho's Rodan to theaters in 1957, to try their own hand at a kaiju film. Their resulting production was Gorgo, released in 1961. The film was directed by Eugene Laurie, who had previously helmed Godzilla Inspiration, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Laurie sought to atone himself for Beast, whose ending, involving the death of the Rhedosaurus, made his daughter cry. Thus, the monsters in Gorgo, a mother-offspring pair of prehistoric monsters, the latter of whom is captured by greedy capitalists bent on displaying it in public, a la King Kong, were essentially framed as protagonists in this piece. This, coupled with an impressive display of beautifully constructed tokusatsu-styled miniature destruction, bestow Gorgo the honor of being one of the first true American kaiju films. The film even features a young boy who feels sorry for Gorgo, trying his damnedest to free the monster and let it live a peaceful life away from civilization. The framing of the capture of Gorgo as morally incorrect, letting the monsters swim away in harmony at the story's conclusion, was a rarity for American-produced monster films at the time, a definite result of the influence of Japanese productions giving their kaiju stars distinct characters. Toho's financial success with King Kong vs. Godzilla prompted the studio to immediately begin work on more Godzilla sequels. 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla was the first of many crossover films from Toho, integrating monsters introduced in their own standalone films into the Godzilla canon. While most fans today view this as the first of a true cinematic universe, akin to those seen in theaters today by Marvel Studios and Warner Bros. DC, it was more likely the result of saving some money on reusing props and costumes already sitting in Toho's warehouses. Although the Godzilla series wasn't in any immediate danger of losing its lush financial backing, the producers at Toho were pretty keen on trying to save as much as they could without sacrificing the overall production's value. But this idea of strained budgets would unfortunately rear its ugly head greater and greater as the Showa Godzilla films continued onward. 1964 was a heavy year for the franchise, as Toho not only released the aforementioned Mothra, but also the elaborate Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, a four-way mayhem of monster fury, debuting one of the most iconic Godzilla monsters of all time in the titular three-headed Golden Hydra. Also returning back from his own solo film was the flying monster Rodan, and another appearance by Mothra. Ghidorah is probably the most essential representation of the Showa Godzilla series of films, not because it's the best of its kind, though it is a great time, but because it features all the kaiju genre's identifiable hallmarks in one nice package. Four of the most iconic kaiju of all time, a cast of great recognizable Toho faces, production design simulating Japan's circumstances at the time, and Honda and Sekizawa's theme of global cooperation coming to a head once again. This cooperative nature would also manifest in the character of Godzilla himself, transforming the once ravenous icon of terror into something of an anti-heroic defender of the Earth. This face turn is definitely due in no small part to a new section of audience members that was steadily attending more and more kaiju films as they were released. Children. In both Japan and in the United States, children's fascination with monsters was growing steadily, with both nations soon approaching a vast explosion in kaiju-related media, ready to launch the genre to its most prominent and recognized period of prosperity. 1965 spawned the first major Japanese attempt at a kaiju film outside of Studio Toho, Daiei's Gamera, the Giant Monster. Originally pitched as a film about giant mutated rats, production problems, to put it extremely lightly, caused the film to be shelved, and the concept of a giant fire-breathing flying turtle was conceptualized instead. Gamera was not given much confidence by Daiei's production crews, viewing it as an inferior imitator to the more popular Godzilla, but director Noriaki Yuasa persevered through all sorts of technical malfunctions and mishaps during filming, eventually completing the film to a rousing success. Gamera may seem like a clear-cut attempt to basically ape the original Godzilla in every angle, from the black and white color palette to the nuclear testing awakening story, but even in his debut film, the character of Gamera displayed some stark differences to Godzilla. Though it took time for Godzilla to become somewhat of a heroic character, Gamera plays that angle for its monster star right from the start, with a turtle kaiju saving a young boy from falling off a lighthouse. The scene appears out of place in the overall plot of the first film, but subsequent depictions of the character would lead into this friend-to-children angle, with Gamera essentially beating Godzilla to the punch on becoming the monster franchise specifically geared towards a younger audience. With the popularity of the kaiju genre slowly on the rise in the West, it wouldn't be long before Hollywood producers would seek out the Japanese studios, offering to co-finance their productions in exchange for concessions designed to appeal to their home markets. This approach led to studios like Toho integrating English actors into a majority of their late 1960s output. Films like Invasion of Astro Monster, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, War of the Gargantuas, and Latitude Zero would feature a central character portrayed by a Hollywood actor. Nick Adams, Russ Tamblyn, Cesar Romero, and Rhodes Reason were just a few among the numerous stars who made the trek to Japan to star in kaiju films. The international appeal of these actors helped the kaiju genre stay relevant in the minds of audiences outside of Japan, but soon it would become apparent that the movie theater wasn't the only place where one could witness the latest in kaiju action. The rise of broadcast television would give birth to the idea that one wouldn't have to trek to a megaplex to see the latest Godzilla movie, when it could instead be viewed in the comfort of your own home. 1966's Ebirah, Horror of the Deep, and 1967's Son of Godzilla were the first Godzilla films to not make it to theaters in the United States, instead going straight to television. They were joined by other contemporaries, such as the continuing Daiei Gamera series of films, and Toei's The Magic Serpent. The TV screen was quickly replacing the movie theater as the go-to destination for kaiju goodness. The 1966 to 1967 kaiju boom saw each one of Japan's major film studios release a kaiju film. Toho had Son of Godzilla and King Kong Escapes, the latter of which yet another US co-production with Studio Rankin Bass, Daiei's Gamera vs. Gyaos, Nikatsu with Gappa the Triphibian Monster, Shochiku in the X from Outer Space, and Toei, along with South Korea's Kyuktong Entertainment, conjured up young Gary. While all these films would hit the box office in Japan, overseas they were instead released straight to television. The impact of TV was not lost on the Japanese studios responsible for the kaiju boom. Effects director Eiji Tsuburaya had long toyed with the idea of creating his own television program with a focus on special effects. Forming his own production studio independent from Toho, Tsuburaya began work on Unbalance, a sort of Japanese Twilight Zone-inspired anthology horror series with which Tsuburaya and crew could experiment with new techniques and bring the thrills of kaiju cinema to homes around the nation. Retitled Ultra Q, a sort of dated reference to the 1964 Summer Olympics, which saw the word ultra become a popular slang term in Japan, the new series hit the airwaves in January of 1966 and ran for a total of 28 episodes. Each episode would feature the characters investigating some sort of supernatural phenomena, usually involving monsters of some manner, shape, or form. At its time, Ultra Q was one of the most expensive television programs ever produced in Japan, but that would pay off in dividends as it quickly grew to enormous popularity across the country. The success of Ultra Q caused broadcast partner Tokyo Broadcasting System to request another monster-centric show from Tsuburaya. The studio quickly began production on a follow-up titled Bemler, Scientific Investigation Agency, a show starring a global monster defense agency fighting malicious beasts with the help of a kaiju on their own side. The angle would be reworked to transform Bemler into Redman, an alien refugee who would merge with one of the defense agency officers to transform into a giant superhero. Redman eventually became Ultraman to better tie in with Ultra Q, and once again, history was made. Ultraman premiered in July of 1966 and became a phenomenon almost overnight. The story was simple. The Science Patrol, a global investigative team, combats alien invaders and giant monsters threatening the planet. Unbeknownst to the team, one of their members, Hayata, has the ability to transform into the titular giant superhero in moments of crisis. Thus, pretty much every episode follows this logline. The Science Patrol investigate a mystery, find out the culprit behind it, and eventually Ultraman is summoned to battle the villain in brilliant tokusatsu glory. Ultraman combined the allure of the kaiju film, with giant monsters rampaging through miniature cities and battling each other, with a new type of television superstar, the Henshin hero. Ultraman is not ultra all the time. His powers are only bestowed upon Hayata thanks to a transformation device, the Beta Capsule. With a triumphant pose and colorful transition, Hayata becomes Ultraman when the device is activated. Ultraman's massive popularity would essentially cause another tokusatsu-related boom, with the rise of other Henshin heroes such as Kamen Rider, Super Sentai, and Zone Fighter. With Tsuburaya's television success and the saturation of kaiju films steadily growing in the theaters, Toho decided to end the Godzilla series for the foreseeable future with a capstone project featuring one last giant monster battle royale. It was time to destroy all monsters. A true gargantuan epic, the film featured 11 kaiju in total, with many returning faces from previous Godzilla films, but also the addition of new monsters to the Big G's mythos, with reruns from unrelated Toho films included in the mixture. The special effects laden Madness, directed by Ishiro Honda naturally, with the effects helmed by Tsuburaya protege Sadamasa Arakawa, features a globally trotting monster rampage thanks to the meddling affairs of intergalactic invaders hell-bent on conquering Earth. Destroy All Monsters truly did feel like one last big hurrah for Toho and the kaiju genre as a whole, but thanks to the adoration of the genre by young audiences around the world, the film would not be the final Godzilla entry after all. However, shifting tides in Toho's financial offices and the sudden illness of kaiju founding father Eiji Tsuburaya would see the Godzilla series undergo a massive restructuring in the following years. December 1969 saw the integration of Toho's Champion Festival, a seasonal film festival event catered exclusively to child audiences, who were on break from school during the spring, summer, and winter seasons. The Godzilla series would live on exclusively in the throes of the Champion Festival, with all new features essentially being targeted towards a single audience who were more interested in giant monster combat than compelling thematic stories targeting international appeal. The first Champion Festival film, All Monsters Attack, was also the first unfortunate victim of the increasingly belt-tightening accountants in Toho's production offices. The budget was significantly smaller than previous years, with most of the expensive special effects sequences relegated to a single large set and including previously seen footage from older Godzilla films in order to save as much money as possible. The following month, in January of 1970, Eiji Tsuburaya passed away, leaving a devastating creative absence in both Toho Studios and Tsuburaya Productions. The loss of one of the kaiju genre's most genuine and ambitious creatives saw a huge blow to morale at Toho, especially in the case of Ishiro Honda, whose 1970 island-focused kaiju film Space Amoeba would not only be the last of Toho's non-Godzilla-oriented kaiju films in the Showa era, but Honda's last film under Toho contract. The dawn of the 1970s would signal the beginning of the end for the Showa era of the kaiju genre. Budgets decreasing, box office prospects sinking, and morale lowering across Japan's major studios were slowly taking their toll on the public perception of kaiju. In America, the monster craze beginning in the 50s was on its final legs, and the future release of major sci-fi blockbuster Star Wars in 1977 would signal the death knell for America's own monster boom. In Japan, Toho's Champion Festival was still releasing new Godzilla films in addition to re-releasing classic films re-edited to cut down on the parts children would lose interest in. Possibly due to the inevitability of declining profits, the newer Godzilla films would take on a more experimental style than ever before, with directors such as Yoshimitsu Banno allowed to take the character in directions never before attempted. Banno's sole Godzilla entry, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, signaled an intent on returning Godzilla to his allegorical roots from 1954, this time the focus shifting from the war to the destruction of the Earth's environment. Godzilla vs. Hedorah's art house, avant-garde style did not sit well with Toho brass, but nevertheless showcased a poignant creative shift for the franchise. Hedorah, the lumbering mass of living waste, was a more striking character, even causing Godzilla far more physical damage and trauma than any opponent prior, almost definitely an intended consequence of the serious issue of pollution the film was raising. 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan featured a pop art manga style to its cinematography, story beats, and characters. The new monster Gigan is definitely the most far-out creature in Toho's pantheon, essentially a living Swiss Army knife from outer space. Budgetary constraints were at their most extreme in 1973's Godzilla vs. Megalon, with the crew given only 3 weeks to shoot the film, both the dramatic scenes involving the human actors and the special effects scenes featuring 3 brand new monster suits and numerous instances of kaiju combat. The character of Jet Jaguar's inclusion and focus in the film is fairly blatant in its homaging of the Henshin hero genre, which was still going strong on television during this time. Ultraman was in the midst of its 3rd new iteration since the passing of Eiji Tsuburaya, and even Toho themselves would try their hand at their own hero with Zone Fighter, even including Godzilla and other Toho monsters in the show for more marquee value. Godzilla's 20th anniversary film, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, received a slight increase in budget due to the prominence of the occasion. Introducing the last of Toho's Big 5 kaiju, a robotic duplicate of Godzilla, vs. Mechagodzilla proved to be a moderate success compared to previous entries in the franchise, but it was still not enough to increase low ticket sales. 1975 saw the release of the final entry in the Showa Godzilla series, Terror of Mechagodzilla, a sequel to the previous year's minor hit. Brought back one last time was director Ishiro Honda and composer Akira Ifukube for a far more darker and serious film, which shied away from the 1970s pop, fun, and experimental tone for something more in line with the golden age of Godzilla films from the early 60s. Despite the lavish production values and big-name crew member returns resulting in a genuinely great piece of kaiju cinema, Terror of Mechagodzilla did not prove to the Toho heads that Godzilla was in any position other than decline. The character was retired, put to rest after a long 20-year run of being Japan's top kaiju movie star. Toho's contemporaries were not any luckier. Earlier in the 1970s, Daiei Studios was in intense financial straits. Partnering with larger studio Nikatsu in the 1970s, who then backed out of the deal a little over a year later, the company filed for bankruptcy in November of 1971. Daiei's Gamera series released one last romp with Gamera vs. Zigra that year before the bankruptcy and resulting riots by Daiei employees who were left in the dark regarding the company's future caused the studio's permanent closure. Tsuburaya's Ultraman would still see regular series released until March of 1975 with the final episode of Ultraman Leo. The rise in popularity of manga, comic books, and anime in Japan at the time caused tokusatsu heroes like Ultraman to be pushed out of the limelight. Attempting to win over the anime crowd in 1979, Tsuburaya partnered with Mobile Suit Gundam creator Sunrise for The Ultraman, an animated incarnation of the original Henshin hero. But that too did not last for long either, ending its run in under a year. The final Ultraman production, and one of the final Showa-era kaiju projects overall, was Ultraman 80, until it too fell to the victim of low ratings in March of 1981. Like Godzilla, Ultraman 2 would be giving a long and seemingly endless vacation. The other final gasping breath of the Showa kaiju era was Gamera Super Monster, an all-monsters attack-type production from short-lived Daiei successor Daiei Film, featuring reused footage of Gamera fighting his entire Showa rogues gallery, ultimately sacrificing himself to protect the planet Earth from malicious invaders. As with Gamera, so too did the Showa kaiju era meet its demise. The Showa era remains the greatest creative period for the entire kaiju genre. Every single iconic character who would become a household name that future generations would continue to enjoy and love was born here. Godzilla, Gamera, and Ultraman would establish themselves as the archetype for which future kaiju media would take inspiration and give adoration for. Though the big three's slumbers did not dissuade future tokusatsu and giant monster pictures from being made, for all intents and purposes, the true kaiju genre itself was in hibernation. But fans, those ravenous enthusiasts that they are, would not allow these characters' studios to let them lie dormant for very long. They began to grow hungry for new adventures with the King of Monsters, the Friend to All Children, and the Hero of Light. And with the Showa era firmly in the past, it was time for a new generation of the kaiju genre to rise. The kaiju world was relatively quiet past the release of Toho's final Showa Godzilla film. The character received a minor resurgence in late 70s America thanks to a 24-issue comic book series from Marvel and a 26-episode animated series from Hanna-Barbera airing on NBC, but once these ceased publication and airing, it was back to radio silence on Godzilla's end, and for the greater kaiju genre as a whole. Though Godzilla was publicly in hibernation, behind the scenes producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was scouring for a good way to bring the Monster King back. Proposal after proposal was offered, each being rejected, except for one. Surprisingly enough, this project was not the brainchild of Tanaka or Toho, but of American horror director Steve Miner. Miner proposed to Toho the first ever all-American produced Godzilla film, tentatively titled Godzilla King of the Monsters in 3D. Despite securing the character's rights and receiving blessing from Toho to go through with the project, Miner ultimately failed to find enough financing to back the film, and the rights reverted to Toho. But Miner's interest in bringing Godzilla to America may have been the spark that lit the flame of the next major era in kaiju history. It seemed as if the progenitor of this unique subgenre of monster film would be the only one capable of bringing it back from the brink of obscurity. Fans of Godzilla were restless with Toho continuing to try and bring their favorite monster back, only to renege at the last possible second. As a result, a Godzilla Resurrection Committee, consisting of tens of thousands of Japanese fans, petitioned Toho to finally bring the character back as its 30th anniversary was fast approaching. This time, there would be no roadblocks, and Toho formally announced the return of Godzilla to Japanese theatrical screens, set for December 15th of 1984. Simply titled Godzilla, acknowledging the character's return to solo features and inferencing a new shift in focus, this new incarnation of the monster saw a return to the form of the original 1954 classic, with Godzilla no longer being an adamant defender of the Earth, but an antagonistic and powerful force of nature. The film also took inspiration from the 54 entry by showering its story with references and allegorical themes to contemporary issues, this time the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Japan in the film, and in real life, were caught in the middle between two global superpowers who seemingly disregarded the other nations around them as little more than obstacles on their nuclear playground. On screen, Keiju Kobayashi portrays the Japanese Prime Minister with great reverence for this angle, a man torn between two warring nations who are salivating at the opportunity to use his vulnerable country for their own selfish gains. Both the US and the Soviets want the chance to launch nuclear missiles at Godzilla in an attempt to destroy the beast, but also costing the country millions of civilian injuries and casualties and rendering their cities uninhabitable. Godzilla was a considerable success at the Japanese box office, officially signaling the return of kaiju cinema to the big screens. And with this success, the Heisei era of the kaiju genre had officially gone underway. The Heisei era, spanning from 1984 to 1998, was not nearly as large or expansive of a time period for kaiju as the Showa era before it. Though beginning 5 years prior, the era is named after the reign of Emperor Akihito beginning in January of 1989 after the death of his father Hirohito. The major backbone of this era was the Heisei Godzilla films from Toho, beginning in 1984, continuing in 1989, and then from 1991 onward, securing yearly releases up until its conclusion in 1995. Toho themselves still produced science fiction films outside of Godzilla, as they had before, but these films did not feature much focus on kaiju. A Soul Fantasy film in 1994 featured tokusatsu-styled mythical creatures, and a trilogy of Mothra-focused films closed out the later years of the era, but beyond those, Toho's focus was primarily Godzilla. The Heisei era stylistically can be attributed to the rise of video and home media, as well as major influences of blockbuster films such as Star Wars and Indiana Jones. Nostalgia too also played a big factor, as filmmakers of the contemporary Heisei era had grown up with the films and television programs of Ishiro Honda and Eiji Tsuburaya. The further development of Japan as a technological superpower also played into the style of these films, with the use of digital optical effects taking a heavy front seat in the special effects department. With the economic boom in the early 80s came the construction of enormous skyscrapers skyscrapers that now dwarf the Showa-era kaiju. As a result, Heisei-era kaiju were increased in size dramatically from a mere 40 to 60 meters to a towering 80 to 120. Japan's global footprint was increasing, and so too were its kaiju. One of the more disturbing and unusual results of the global kaiju phenomenon was Pulgasari, the sole North Korean kaiju film. Based on a supposed Korean legend of the Bulgasari, the film's director, Shin Sang-ok, was kidnapped in 1978 along with his wife by North Korean intelligence under the orders of dictator Kim Jong-il. Pulgasari, Sang-ok's final film before he and his wife escaped to the United States, tells the story of a feudal Korean nation under the siege of a dastardly king. His peasants subject call upon the gods of Earth to bring to life an iron-eating golem named Pulgasari to ravage the palace and save the peasants from scourge and strife. For the film's monster effects, staff from Toho Studios, including Heisei Godzilla actor Kenpachiro Satsuma, were tricked into working on the project, believing the film to be a Chinese production. Undoubtedly the kaiju film with the most unusual production history, Pulgasari nevertheless showcased the sheer reach and influence of the kaiju genre around the globe, even long after the genre's peak. In addition to Pulgasari, 1985 saw Toho's Godzilla reboot released to American theaters in another heavily edited and revised format, with Raymond Burr reprising his role from the 1956 original Americanization. The American editors either didn't appear to understand or deliberately altered the film's political messaging, changing the Russian and American depictions from chaotically neutral agitators to cartoonishly evil and heroic caricatures respectively. Though again, Burr takes the subject matter seriously and tries his best, the American edit, awkwardly christened Godzilla 1985, proved to be an inferior product to its Japanese counterpart, and audiences overseas agreed, panning the film critically and delivering less than desirable box office returns. 4 years would pass before a new Godzilla film from Toho, though the character continued to stay relevant through an onslaught of merchandise and promotions related to or prompted by the new reboot. The growing interest in innovation in home video gaming systems saw a few Godzilla games released for popular consoles such as the MSX and the Nintendo Entertainment System, and American developer Bally Midway took advantage of both kaiju film nostalgia and the growing video arcade scene with Rampage in 1986, featuring original kaiju characters. Dark Horse Comics took up the reins from Marvel with a one-shot Godzilla comic book special in 1987, and followed it up with a translated American import of the 1984 Godzilla manga adaptation. The Ultra series briefly awakened in 1987 for Ultraman USA, a feature-length animated feature co-produced by Hanna-Barbera and Tsuburaya Productions, intending to launch a full-blown animated series in the United States, which ultimately never came to be. Finally, in 1989, Godzilla returned with Godzilla vs. Biollante, the first new monster vs. monster film in the series since the Mechagodzilla duo of films. Initially entered in a Godzilla story contest held by Toho, Biollante is as unique of a film as its method of origin. The film's story is primarily focused on the weaponization of genetic engineering. Biollante, a fusion of Godzilla cells and plant DNA, encapsulates the reckless dangers of the process through the guilt of its creator, Dr. Shiragami, whose daughter perished during a skirmish for the Godzilla cells by competing international espionage agencies. Versus Biollante continued the political intrigue from the 1984 reboot, but dialed it back somewhat, shifting to a more action-oriented spectacle. Newcomer special effects director Koichi Kawakita, who had worked previously on some of the early Showa-era films uncredited, brought his optical photography experience to his work on Biollante, which gave the production's effects sequences a slight feel of that era. This is most apparent with the elaborate marionette wirework of the massive Biollante final form costume, whose ferocious battle with Godzilla calls to mind some of Tsuburaya and crew's best brawls from years past. Another trademark of Kawakita's Showa-era influence came in the form of futuristic Japanese Defense Force units. The Super X, a flying battleship first introduced in the 1984 Godzilla, makes a return here in a newly reconstructed form, and Kawakita proceeded his work on Biollante, helming effects on Toho's Gunhead, a giant mecha film. Future installments would see an increase in these types of weaponry showing up in the Heisei Godzilla series, evolving and expanding its universe much like the Showa series of Godzilla films did as well. Despite the slickness of the new film, vs. Biollante failed to make a substantial splash at the Japanese box office. Disappointment from Godzilla 1985 likely caused Toho to avoid releasing the film in American theaters, though it would eventually be released to home video in 1992. The beginning of the 90s saw the true return of one of the kaiju genre's biggest heroes, literally. The Ultraman series finally made its return not in Japan, and strangely not even the United States, but in Australia. Ultraman Towards the Future, the first live-action Ultra series in 16 years, was a joint production by the South Australian Film Corporation and Tsuburaya Productions. The cast and crew were entirely composed of English-speaking personnel, and the show itself was filmed in English. The small one-season, 13-episode show didn't make much of a splash in the West or East, but spawned a surprisingly sizable number of merchandise, such as a video game and a line of toys in America. Towards the Future wasn't the only foreign Ultra series to be produced, with Ultraman the Ultimate Hero following suit in 1993, another all-English production filmed in America. Surprisingly, despite being filmed in the United States, the show never aired there, going straight to video in Japan instead. Back at Toho, the Godzilla series' past 2 box office sales resulted in executives strategically planning their next move for the franchise. The decision was made to revive one of Godzilla's most famous co-stars, the flying three-headed arch-rival King Ghidorah. The aptly named Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah landed in Japanese theaters in 1991, with third time being the charm for the Heisei series of films, as it was a bigger success than before. Thus, for the foreseeable future of the Heisei Godzilla series, Godzilla would continue to face recognizable monster enemies alongside newly created creatures, combining the best of both worlds. Versus King Ghidorah also continued the story and brought back characters from both Biollante and the 1984 film, officially cementing the Heisei Godzilla series as one long overarching continuity. Continuity has received seldom mention for kaiju films up until now, as most of the films before the Heisei era didn't really rely on audiences remembering story beats from previous releases. Kaiju were more easily able to be crossed over from film to film, as they were far more recognizable and memorable to audiences than their human co-stars. With the advent of home media, allowing audience members to actually own and screen the films they saw at theaters in their own homes, more emphasis was placed on connecting characters beyond just including kaiju from other films. The character of Miki Segusa, played by actress Megumi Odaka, and introduced in 1989's Godzilla vs. Biollante, was the main avatar for this mentality, being prominently featured in every Heisei Godzilla film aside from the 1984 film. Segusa's character, a young psychic with a special connection to Godzilla, provided an emotional link to the character for audiences. Godzilla no longer expressed as much visible emotion as he had in the Showa series of films. The Heisei Godzilla's character was in stark contrast to the Showa depiction, consistently being portrayed as a stoic, anti-hero force of nature throughout the entire run of the series, with character development occurring by means of outside forces rather than internal conflict. The Heisei series continued under this flag of returning classic monsters and continuing the overarching story over the next 2 years, with 1992's Godzilla vs. Mothra featuring the return of everyone's favorite insect goddess, in 1993 culminating in the triple threat return of flying kaiju Rodan, an adoptive offspring for Godzilla, and the mechanical doppelganger Mechagodzilla. The returning monsters received significant changes to their Showa-era incarnations. King Ghidorah was no longer a monster from the depths of outer space, but rather a mirroring rival to Godzilla, born of a fusion of 3 future-dwelling pets merged by an H-bomb test. Mothra, originally the deity of a small island and its native population in the Pacific, transformed into an overt defender of the planet, still featuring her ties to Infant Island, but shifting focus to a more global operation. Rodan was shrunken down, originally as tall as Godzilla himself, and given a parasitic relationship to the Monster King's new infant, who itself was designed to mirror more realistic dinosaur depictions that had been gaining momentum during the 90s dinosaur renaissance, especially the release of Jurassic Park. And Mechagodzilla received a full-blown turning of the code, changing from an alien war machine into a futuristic superweapon deployed by mankind against Godzilla. These changes, shocking and contrasting as they were a necessary adjustment for audiences in order to avoid stale retreads of the classic films, and the changes turned out to be a non-factor in affecting general audiences' joy at seeing these classic monsters return, as Godzilla vs. Mothra and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla turned in quite the profit for Toho. There was no doubt about it now. Godzilla was back. And an old idea, still rattling around in the inner depths of the other side of the world, suddenly began making a prominent recovery. Accompanying Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla's 1993 theatrical release were 2 prominent teaser trailers, one for next year's new Toho film, and the other for something long thought lost to time: an American Godzilla adaptation. A year prior, Sony had acquired the rights from Toho for the character and bequeathed it to their studio TriStar. A screenplay was quickly produced by Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott, and fresh off the hit film Speed, Jan de Bont was attached to direct. De Bont, Rossio, and Elliott's enthusiasm for the project were a promising sign to Toho executives, who were themselves excited, if cautious, about a new vision for their monster icon. While the American Godzilla film entered pre-production, Toho started to wind down its own series of Godzilla movies. Vs. Mechagodzilla was initially slated to be the final Godzilla movie, both to avoid competition with the TriStar remake and in honor of Showa-era director Ishiro Honda, who had sadly passed away in 1993. But sticky situations immediately reared their heads over in America. Jan de Bont, in a feud with TriStar executives over the film's proposed budget, had left the project. Rossio and Elliott's script was reconstructed and rewritten dozens of times, with various new writers brought in to try and salvage the film from being over-budgeted. With each rewrite came hesitation from each new director TriStar offered the project to. The intended release date of 1994 was nowhere near being close to met. And so, Toho continued on with their own series of films, introducing new monsters for the final 2 entries in the series: 1994's Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, which also saw the reintroduction of Mogera, a Showa-era mechanical kaiju from sci-fi classic The Mysterians, a favorite of special effects director Koichi Kawakita. With its sequel the following year, 1995's Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, Toho began advertising it as the true final Godzilla film for the 20th century. Kanji adorning the film's advertising material explicitly showcased its biggest marketing hook: Godzilla dies. And died the monster did. An emotional ending to the now 40-year-old character, Godzilla melts down at the end of the film, set to an emotional funeral march orchestrated by series maestro Akira Ifukube, bringing a near-definitive end to the Japanese arm of the franchise, allowing Hollywood's interpretation to take over. At least it would once the project stopped circling the proverbial drain. Still without a director in 1995, TriStar's production problems would ensure that Godzilla's tenure in the Heisei era of kaiju would remain off the table for now. Toho themselves placated fans of the franchise with a new trilogy of Mothra-focused movies. Unfortunately, the films themselves were unmistakably geared towards children, exclusively featuring simplistic plots and flashing color ray bombardments aplenty. Unsurprisingly, the trilogy was a financial disappointment, even with the third entry's use of King Ghidorah to draw out more ticket sales, and Toho ceased production on kaiju films for another small hiatus. Though 1995 heralded the death of one of the kaiju genre's biggest icons, it would also see the rebirth of another. Daiei, having returned from its bankruptcy in 1974 thanks to an asset seizure by publishing company Tokuma Shoten, unleashed its revitalized turtle icon in Gamera, Guardian of the Universe, helmed by freelance up-and-coming director Shusuke Kaneko. A slick, stylish modern reimagining of the friend of all children, Guardian of the Universe updated Gamera for the modern age, reintroducing its enemy monster Gyaos as the initial opponent. Much like Toho's Heisei incarnations of its classic monsters, the Heisei-era Gamera and Gyaos' origins were retooled. Both were genetically engineered bioweapons of the ancient civilization of Atlantis, created by the Atlanteans harnessing the power of mana, the life energy of our planet. This new history for the characters brought an inherent mysticism and fully developed story to the film, something the Showa Gamera films tended to pass over in favor of fun fantasy sequences. Gamera was no longer just for children, but for older audiences just as much, if not more. Guardian of the Universe's fresh take on the long-dormant character was met with financial success and immense critical acclaim. Director Kaneko was lauded for the film's well-crafted story and memorable fleshed-out characters, while special effects director Shinji Higuchi's model work and monster sequences also received adulation. This praise would even see the film compared preferably to the entirety of Toho's Heisei Godzilla series, which had received criticism all through its later years of being overly corporate and sterile productions. Guardian of the Universe won many awards at numerous Japanese film festivals and even received a rare theatrical screen run in the United States thanks to company ADV Films, which also produced a brand new English dub for the film as well. The first film's success meant a sequel was quickly tracked into production. 1996 was a prominent year for the kaiju genre. Gamera 2, Attack of Legion, was released by Daiei, continuing the planned trilogy helmed by Kaneko again to critical and commercial success, and Ultraman would finally receive a brand new weekly Japanese-produced television series, Ultraman Tiga, and a theatrically released film, Ultraman Zearth, for the franchise's 30th anniversary. Zearth was an out-and-about parody of the Ultra series, but Tiga was the true return to form for the character. Tiga was a home run for Tsuburaya, catapulting the Ultra franchise back into the eyes of the Japanese cultural consciousness. Tiga's immense popularity in Japan, coupled with the rising success of American franchise Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, saw the series receive an English dub from 4Kids Entertainment, who aired the series on Fox Channel's Foxbox programming block in the early 2000s. Tiga spawned 3 theatrically released movie tie-ins and a direct-to-video special, and remains one of the most iconic and popular Ultra heroes of all time. 1996 was also important in that the American Godzilla remake finally received a director. 2 of them, in fact. Fresh off the heels of their blockbuster action extravaganza Independence Day, Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich were offered the project by Sony. Initially hesitant to accept, the duo relented once they requested special control over the film's story, officially tossing Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott's 1993 script for one of their own. Devlin and Emmerich were adamant on altering Godzilla, both in look and feel, for the modern generation of filmmaking. Gone were the days of yore featuring a man in a big rubber costume. This Godzilla would be made via state-of-the-art computer-generated effects instead. Hiring creature designer Patrick Tatopoulos, they commissioned a dramatically redesigned look for the kaiju, slimming the creature down significantly, adding more distinctly reptilian features such as a dewlap and digitigrade legs, making it stand horizontally, and adding a chin, of all things. The new Godzilla was, frankly, not what Toho was expecting. When presented with the design, the studio was naturally taken aback by what they had in front of them. Devlin and Emmerich were hesitant as well to budge from their radical concept, and Toho eventually relented, telling Emmerich, "You make the new Godzilla, we keep the old one." Emmerich and Devlin's Godzilla film finally made it to production in the summer of 1997, targeted with a very strict Memorial Day 1998 release. While filming took place over the summer and into the fall, marketing began drafting ideas for advertising the film. Emmerich and Devlin's idea was to hide the new design of Godzilla entirely, essentially making the creature's radical new look a surprise for audiences, especially hardcore fans of the franchise who were wary of a Hollywood makeover for the Big G. The idea was approved and a mass assortment of tie-in product was designed, some able to be released before the film, such as Taco Bell promotional products, while others, like Treadmaster's expansive toy line, were to be held off until that fateful Memorial Day when the film premiered. When the day came, all hell broke loose. First came the box office results. Sony had predicted that the film would gross $100 million in its opening weekend, but it only managed around 44. The film would slowly droop downwards in ticket sales, eventually resulting in a worldwide total of $380 million at the end of its run. While technically a financial success, the film had performed terribly to expectations, souring any intention on Sony's part of a potential franchise. But the worst aspect of the film's release was the film itself. A headline for an opening article in Godzilla fan magazine G-Fan read, "Our worst nightmare come true." Indeed, the American Godzilla remake, a trial of hardships spread out over nearly the entire decade of the 90s, resulted in a film that not only defied expectations of grandeur from contemporary audiences, but also reviled and insulted the original Japanese character, its films, and its fans. Enough mud has been slung at this film, so needless to say, the 1998 Godzilla film from TriStar was an obtuse failure. 25 years after its inception, modern critique is a little lighter on the film. Its reputation was certainly helped by the airing of a much more positively received animated sequel television series, which depicted a surviving Godzilla offspring as much more in line with the traditional Japanese character and personality. Regardless of the end product and intentions behind it, the 1998 film was wholly responsible for keeping the name of Godzilla alive in the minds of audiences and fans throughout the end of the 90s. With TriStar's debacle finally resolved in 1998, the Heisei era had finally passed an immense roadblock. Though 1998 is considered the final year of the Heisei era, the epilogue to it would come a year later with the release of the final installment in Shusuke Kaneko's Gamera trilogy, Gamera 3: Revenge of Iris. The most cerebral, thought-provoking, and discussed entry in the Heisei Gamera series, the film received yet again mass critical acclaim, firmly cementing Shusuke Kaneko and Shinji Higuchi in the annals of kaiju history as some of the greatest filmmakers and craftsmen of the genre's history. The film's box office gross wasn't up to par, and a planned fourth installment ultimately went unproduced. A sad outcome, but considering Revenge of Iris' finale is left open-ended and ambiguous, perhaps not the most egregious of losses. The Heisei era of the kaiju genre is sometimes labeled as the Silver Age, much like the way in which classic comic book eras are categorized with gold, silver, and bronze. The Heisei era's film output was not nearly as creatively ambitious as the Showa era, but the vast technological advancements society had made from the beginning of the 80s to the dawn of the new millennium allowed for the far greater reaches of global communication, ensuring kaiju fans a new way to communicate and congregate with each other. The internet. The rise of the World Wide Web resulted in a new type of boom for the kaiju genre, the birth of a central kaiju fandom. The monster crazes of the 50s and 60s limited specific kaiju fandom to the letter pages of horror-focused monster magazines and sandboxes and playgrounds worldwide. As monster magazines continued to thrive throughout the late 60s and early 70s, one fan, Greg Shoemaker, began publishing a magazine of his own, based out of his love for Eiji Tsuburaya films and a disdain for the general public's perception of Japanese special effects films. Titling it The Japanese Fantasy Film Journal, Shoemaker's first issue of the magazine was published in 1968 at a run of only 25 copies, which were distributed through other fan magazines with the hopes of attracting readers. Shoemaker's magazine eventually managed to secure a stable fan base, including Hollywood directors like Joe Dante. A number of contributors to JFFJ eventually went on to produce their own kaiju-related content or even obtain jobs in the entertainment industry, arguably making Shoemaker's magazine the foundations that modern kaiju fandom was built on. In 1992, the first Godzilla-centric magazine began publishing under the name of G-Force, before switching to G-Fan around issue 9. Published by J.D. Lees, the magazine was a small newsletter before growing larger in subscriptions. G-Fan was widely considered the central hub of the American kaiju fandom in the 1990s, due to its extensive bi-monthly publishing schedule and a wealth of information and submissions from fans. With the arrival of the internet to a majority of households worldwide, fans could interact with each other no matter the distance and instantaneously without the use of letter mail. Possibly the earliest recorded interactions of kaiju fans online is through the alt.movies.monster Usenet group. Mark Maloon's Godzilla page is generally regarded as being the first Godzilla-centric website, having been posted sometime in mid-1994. Maloon's website was notable for being one of the first internet sites with information on the Heisei series, as the series was releasing in Japan at the time and information in English outside of the pages of G-Fan was relatively scarce. As the internet grew larger and more accessible, so too did the kaiju fandom. The 1998 Godzilla film was a critical failure, but even with its modest box office return, TriStar was still adamant about a sequel taking place. Emmerich and Devlin fought back and forth with the studio on a solid release date, eventually settling on the year 2004. When Toho received word of this change of plans, they quickly moved in to capitalize on the lack of Godzilla focus in theaters around the world. And as is tradition, when Godzilla emerges from hiatus, he brings with him the dawn of a new era in kaiju history. With TriStar's American Godzilla sequel effectively canned, Toho decided not to let the King of Monsters stay dormant for very long. With a new entry immediately put into production for a release just before Y2K, the 1999 year signaled the launch of a brand new Godzilla and yet another historical change for the kaiju genre. In most aspects, the Millennium Era is virtually indistinguishable stylistically from the Heisei era. In fact, most tokusatsu series outside of Godzilla still identified works produced during this time as belonging to the Heisei period. The identifiable components of the Millennium Era mostly lie in the increasing occurrence of digital technologies used in production of kaiju media. The tokusatsu style was still being used at every possible instance, but far more elaborate shots and compositions prompted the use of computer-generated imagery, or CGI, in order to make them more presentable. Kaiju were beginning to take their first enormous steps into the digital age of filmmaking. The Millennium Era also marked the end of the third major Godzilla series of films, with the character's second full-blown hiatus occurring at the end of its 50th anniversary in 2004. Unlike the 1995 retirement, there would be no American counterpart waiting in the wings to take over. For better or worse, Godzilla was in hibernation once again. But before his eventual farewell from the silver screen, Toho had planned a new series of Millennium Godzilla films to be released yearly once again. Unlike its Heisei predecessors, however, the Millennium series intentionally did not follow a strict continuity. This was a deterrence put in place by Toho in order to secure a wider variety of ideas from writers and directors for their own takes on the Godzilla character. The first of these was Godzilla 2000 Millennium, directed by Heisei alumni Takao Okawara. Taking place in a world with Godzilla already fully established as a regular occurrence, the film follows the exploits of the Godzilla Prediction Network, a sort of storm chaser type of organization dedicated to predicting the whereabouts and eventual appearances of Godzilla in civilized areas. Protagonists Yuji and Io Shinoda, a father-daughter duo, are flanked by Yuki Ichinose, a reporter attempting to boost her portfolio with up-close and personal pictures of Godzilla. The trio run afoul of Katagiri, head of Crisis Control Intelligence, the Japanese government's antithesis to the GPN, focusing on finding ways to stop and destroy Godzilla. Both groups' clashing ideologies come to a head when a giant flying rock is discovered in the Japan Trench, turning out to be a fossilized millennia-year-old spaceship. The inhabitants, still alive but devolved into a formless liquid, arrived on Earth to, what else, conquer it and modify the planet's atmosphere to suit their own needs. The aliens see Godzilla's super regenerative ability as a boon to their plans, and immediately seek to absorb his genetic material, unintentionally mutating themselves into the monstrous Orga, Godzilla's first new opponent since 1995. Godzilla 2000 brought the character back from a reputation soured by the Emmerich and Devlin mishap, returning the beast to a more aggressive disposition and facing off against an enemy monster once again. Godzilla 2000 received a rare American theatrical release and was dubbed and edited by TriStar, who still owned distribution rights to the character. The American version was surprisingly tactful of its source material, sneaking in a few comedic lines here and there, but treating the overall production seriously. Instead of Caucasian voice actors speaking Midwestern accents for the characters, Asian American actors were brought on instead to give the dub a sense of legitimacy. Some of the film's more empty soundscapes were livened up with additional Foley tracks and roars swiped from the 1998 movie. This Americanization process was overseen and approved by Toho and director Okawara, a first for the Godzilla series. The attempt was a success, at least critically in the eyes of the fandom, as the American version of Godzilla 2000 is often seen as equal to or even superior to the Japanese original. But in its initial US theatrical run, the film was not a success to TriStar. It needed to gross at least $12 to $15 million to make the effort worth it, but the film only made just shy of $10 million. This apathetic response to the film was most likely a casualty of the 1998 film's poor reception among audiences. TriStar would then pass on releasing any future Millennium Godzilla films to theaters for this reason. The 1998 Godzilla film's ripple effect caused a slight sensation for kaiju films in other countries. A 40-year-old relic from the age of the original kaiju boom received an unexpected reimagining in 1999, thanks to South Korean director Shim Hyung-rae. Somehow, young Gary returned. Despite originating in South Korea, the film consisted entirely of Western actors and was filmed entirely in English. I guess it's just a thing for kaiju media. The film's production was predominantly expensive for a South Korean film, even taking the title of most expensive film ever produced in the country for a time. And looking at the final product, you wouldn't really think that. And what we're looking at is the revised and upgraded edition to boot. Despite the film's lavish financial backing from various corporations and even the South Korean government, young Gary was hardly given the time to properly execute its ambitious story. Highly detailed monster suits were built for the production, but ultimately went unused in favor of computer effects to save time. The film barely made its July 1999 release date, and the original release print of the film featured numerous unfinished effects. Later in 2001, the newly minted Upgrade Edition was released and remains the only version of the film currently available. The year 2000 rolled around, and Toho continued its new Godzilla series with Godzilla x Megaguirus, bringing in new director Masaaki Tezuka to helm it. This film, another reboot ignoring the events of Godzilla 2000, featured the surprise return of the Mega Nulon, an insect kaiju that first appeared in the original Rodan back in 1956, updated and modified with a new life cycle turning into the titular giant dragonfly kaiju. It also saw the return of a more outlandish science fiction style to the Godzilla series, contrasting Godzilla 2000's more grounded approach. The film didn't quite have an impact on the box office, prompting Toho to reach back into its catalog for the next entries. While Toho was beginning to stumble somewhat with the Millennium Godzilla series, Tsuburaya Productions continued to prosper on Japanese television screens with the continuing Heisei assortment of Ultraman television shows. Ultraman Tiga was followed by Ultraman Dyna and Gaia in 1997 and 1998, and Ultraman Neos, originally planned for release around the same time as Tiga, was released direct-to-video. Ultraman Cosmos, airing in 2001, was a unique entry in the Ultra series featuring a pacifist Ultra who preferred to end conflicts with kindness rather than destructive beam weapons. The series remains the longest-running Ultra series at a whopping 65 episodes, coupled with 3 tie-in films. In 2004, Tsuburaya launched the Ultra N Project, a new directive to revitalize the series for a new audience. A theatrical film, simply titled Ultraman, predated a new, more adult-oriented Ultra series, Ultraman Nexus. Nexus's unfortunate time slot issues, being broadcast in the very early morning, and its darker tone different from previous Ultra shows led to lower ratings and saw its run being cut short with a sequel to the film scrapped. The following shows, Ultraman Max in 2005 and Ultraman Mebius in 2006, were a return to the more Monster of the Week oriented, lighter tone style. Mebius, especially being broadcast in 2006, was a 40th anniversary celebration of the entire Ultra legacy, with returning heroes and monsters aplenty. This idea of bringing back old Ultra Kaiju to fill out the roster of new shows would continue to be something Tsuburaya would lean in on for future series. After Mebius concluded, another attempt at an adult-focused Ultra series was concocted with Ultra 7X, but it didn't last for very long with yet another inane time slot choice of airing at 2:15 in the morning. But back in 2001, Toho was at an impasse. The lower box office returns of Godzilla x Megaguirus panicked the studio into wanting a new Godzilla film with more recognizable star power, both in the case of featured enemy monsters and behind the camera. Toho secured Heisei Gamera director Shusuke Kaneko for the next Millennium entry, resulting in Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, or GMK for sanity's sake. Kaneko's original pitch for the film featured Showa-era monsters Anguirus and Varan in the title roles instead, alongside Baragon as well in a supporting role. Toho's insistence on recognizable characters saw the 2 reptilian kaiju replaced with the more marketable Mothra and Ghidorah, with little, if any, changes done to the actual story. Baragon surprisingly managed to survive the rewrites, appearing in its first film role since its cameo in 1968's Destroy All Monsters. GMK naturally became one of the most intriguing and impactful Millennium Godzilla films. Kaneko's influence on the film's screenplay, along with the work by Keiichi Hasegawa and Masahiro Yokotani, allowed it to venture into territories no Godzilla film had dared go before: the atrocities committed by Japan during World War II. In the story, Godzilla is claimed to be possessed by the spirits of those killed by the country during the war, wreaking vengeance on a modern Japan for having forgotten and buried their past sins. The film ruminates on the idea of Japan as a physical country and as an ideological nation. The guardian monsters, Mothra, King Ghidorah, and Baragon, are defending Japan from the wrath of Godzilla, but not the citizens or the civilization they've erected. GMK's revival of old favorites with an all-star director turned out to be the money-making formula Toho had needed, with the film topping box office charts upon release and becoming the highest-grossing Millennium Godzilla film. Now knowing that recognizable characters equaled financial success, Toho's next feature would bring back Megaguirus director Masaaki Tezuka for a new try at revitalizing Godzilla's mechanical nemesis, Mechagodzilla. 2002's Godzilla x Mechagodzilla not only brought a new, stylish, and upgraded robot to the Millennium series, but also featured model-turned-actress Yumiko Shaku in the starring role. Despite her background as a gravure idol, Shaku's character is a surprisingly strong female lead. Akane Yashiro's guilt over her squad's death at the hands of Godzilla paints her character's motivations, and the story of her triumph over this by piloting the new Mechagodzilla provides the glut of the film's story. The new Mechagodzilla featured another origin overhaul, this time being a cyborg formed from DNA-based computer systems and built around the skeleton of the original 1954 Godzilla. Like clockwork, Godzilla x Mechagodzilla's box office succeeded once again, and Toho immediately put director Tezuka to work on a sequel, marking Godzilla x Mechagodzilla as the only Millennium Godzilla film with a direct follow-up. Godzilla Tokyo SOS was released in 2003. This time, Godzilla and Mechagodzilla were joined by Mothra and her larval spawn, with the story revolving around the insect goddess pleading with the Japanese government to return the original Godzilla's bones to their natural resting place, having desecrated the cycle of life with their cyborg creation. Sadly, Yumiko Shaku's Akane doesn't return for anything more than a minor cameo, with new lead Yoshiro Chujo taking center stage instead. On the bright side, this film did feature a decent number of callbacks to the original 1961 Mothra film, including a returning Hiroshi Koizumi, reprising his role as Professor Chujo. The special effects sequences, directed by Eiichi Asada, are some of the Godzilla series' best and most detailed. But for whatever reason, Tokyo SOS did not perform as well as X-Mechagodzilla did, and Toho decided that after 2004, Godzilla's 50th anniversary, the Monster King would return to retirement once more. With half a century's worth of Godzilla under their belt, Toho decided to send their big star out with an equally big bang. Recruiting director Ryuei Kitamura, hot off the heels of his breakout hit debut Versus, Toho set out to make Godzilla's Big 5-0 film a massive celebration of all things Godzilla. The monster cast would be the largest ever witnessed in the franchise's history, with many returning favorites from the Showa series who hadn't been seen since their debut film. Gigan, Anguirus, King Caesar, Manda, Hedorah, among others, would receive brand new designs to bring them into the modern age of tokusatsu. Shockingly enough, even Sony's 1998 American Godzilla managed to make it into the film, under the new, intentionally less imposing name of Zilla. The film also brought back a host of returning Showa-era actors and characters, the Exilians from Invasion of Astro Monster, the battleship Gatengo from Atragon, and Showa stars Akira Takarada, Kenji Sahara, and Kumi Mizuno. Prior to its official release on December 4, 2004, Toho promoted the absolute hell out of the film with a massive marketing campaign celebrating the character's 50th birthday, including a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, culminating in Godzilla Final Wars' world premiere at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, California on November 29th. Things were gearing up for the film to be the biggest of all Godzilla's adventures, and judging by its whopping 19 billion yen budget, the highest ever for a Godzilla film, it was definitely make it or break it. The reception to Final Wars was mixed. Some fans liked the fast-paced, breakneck approach to the film, with its large cast of monsters and heavy focus on action, both kaiju-related and in the human story. Others derided it for being too far out there for such an important milestone for Godzilla, especially critiquing its influence from other 2000s action films such as The Matrix. Contemporary responses towards the film trend more positive, at least now that the caveat of it being the final Godzilla film for the foreseeable future was no longer applicable. But, as almost to be expected, Final Wars crashed and burned at the box office, officially signaling that Godzilla, and by extension the kaiju genre, no longer had the pull it once had. The end was in sight for the Millennium Era. Not one to let a kaiju era end without one last hurrah, Kadokawa Herald Pictures, now the owners of Daiei and their film library, managed to put out Gamera the Brave in 2006. Gamera's sole Millennium Era appearance on the screen, the film brought the series back to its original child-friendly tone while still providing an emotional and mature story throughout. The film follows Toru Ozawa, a young boy living with his widowed father, who finds an unusual egg that hatches into the son of Gamera, who sacrificed himself years prior to defeat a swarm of marauding Gyaos. Calling him Toto, Toto befriends the young turtle, who quickly grows to an immense size, just as a giant lizard-like kaiju named Zetus begins attacking nearby cities, prompting the young Gamera to battle it in order to follow in his father's footsteps and save Japan. Despite being an expertly crafted new entry in the Gamera series, The Brave suffered the same fate as Godzilla Final Wars and bombed at the box office. The kaiju genre's hopes for a life preserver had ultimately faded. The Millennium Era was no more. Though the Millennium Era's kaiju media output is similar in style and tone to that of the later Heisei era, the true differences between the two can be identified in the further evolution of the growing online kaiju fandom. The internet continued to expand rapidly past Y2K, with more and more kaiju webpages such as Toho Kingdom, Kaiju Headquarters, Rodan's Roost, and Godzilla Tower cropping up. The internet's growth also saw a general increase in access to merchandise for kaiju franchises, thanks in no small part to the rise of eBay and other online auction sites and storefronts. A combination of the growing kaiju community across the world and the increase in accessibility to kaiju merchandise led to the creation of G-Fest in the late 90s. Originally a small gathering specifically for editors and contributors to the G-Fan fanzine, the meetups quickly blossomed into a modest convention, taking place over long weekends and expanding from single rooms in a Howard Johnson's to sprawling convention centers and hotel ballrooms. Alternating between shows in the Chicago, Illinois area and Southern California, the convention eventually settled in Rosemont, a suburb of Chicago. To this very day, G-Fest continues to attract hundreds of attendees per year, each giddy with the opportunity to meet up with fellow like-minded kaiju fanatics to talk shop, attend panels with kaiju icons, dress up in their own monster costumes, as well as spend unholy amounts of disposable cash in the legendary dealer's room. In the end, the Millennium Era of the kaiju genre can be seen as the last gasp of a big resurgence in interest that began back in 1998 with the first American Godzilla film. Some scholars have theorized that the film's ultimately poor reception soured both the name of Godzilla and the kaiju genre itself to various different regions around the world, who had imported little, if any, prior Godzilla films, essentially making Sony's film their first encounter with the creature. In America, it was hard to distinguish the Japanese Godzilla from its American cousin. Casual moviegoers who weren't in the know would assume Godzilla 2000, for example, would star Matthew Broderick. In Japan, it seemed as though the general public was simply burnt out on too much monster action, which essentially had been yearly events for Japan since 1991. With Godzilla retired, Gamera shelved, and the Ultraman series shifting its focus away from the titular silver-suited heroes for its next series, the kaiju genre entered its own form of modified hibernation. Kaiju fans would have to subsist on a more underground form of giant monster entertainment for the next several years, while the big hitters were seemingly out to lunch. Almost every fandom has a period of time that it dubs the Dark Ages. With Transformers, it was the period in the mid-1990s when the original generation of classic toys went out of production and no new cartoon series were airing or comic books being published. For Star Wars fans, the time between Return of the Jedi's release in 1983 and the start of the expanded universe in 1991 was a trying time for fan discussion and content. For kaiju fans, the 5-year gap from 2007 to 2012 was a period of uncomfortable silence. No new major franchise content was being produced, save for Tsuburaya Productions' Ultra series, and even the prevalent merchandise that had accompanied many a quiet period of kaiju history had seemingly slowed down. Many fans like to dub this time period the Wilderness Years, a term taken from the Doctor Who fandom, who experienced their own extended drought of an eye-popping 16 years without a major series of televised TARDIS adventures, surviving only on small book series and radio dramas until the franchise relaunch in 2005. Like the Whovians' own Dark Age, there wasn't really a pure lack of kaiju content in the Wilderness Years, just that it was extremely scattershot. And what media there was during this time was far different, more irreverent in tone and parodic of the kaiju genre's identifiable tropes. These were mostly independent productions, made by people who had either worked themselves on major studio kaiju films in the past, or had a loving reverence for them and attempted their own hand at adding to the genre they adored. For Tsuburaya, the Ultra series had shifted its attention from the giant henshin heroes that built its foundations to its other iconic pillar, the Ultra Kaiju. Premiering in December of 2007, Ultra Galaxy Mega Monster Battle took place in a far-off future where kaiju are extinct on Earth. Universe-patrolling organization Zap Spacey arrives on a mysterious planet that somehow is full of kaiju. Meeting a mysterious monster trainer named Ray, the crew attempts to figure out what exactly happened to the planet and who Ray really is. Ultra Galaxy's focus on pure monster combat would make it a hit for kaiju fans salivating over anything new to come from Japan during the Wilderness Years. But it seemed as if Tsuburaya wasn't entirely confident in the project, as it would air exclusively on a pay-per-view service in Japan. A second series would follow in 2008, Ultra Galaxy Neo, and would be the first new Ultra series produced after Tsuburaya Productions would sell a majority of its assets to advertising company Taiyo Inc. Bandai, the main Ultra series licensor since at least the 1980s, obtained a near 50% stake in the company as well in 2009. And Taiyo would eventually sell its stakes to pachinko manufacturer Fields Corporation in 2010. The Ultra series would soon abandon its original television programs for a few years, switching towards a theatrical film output starting in 2010 with Mega Monster Battle Ultra Galaxy Legend and ending in Ultraman Saga in 2012. But aside from biography-focused clip show Ultraman Retsuden in 2010, Tsuburaya would effectively place Ultraman on television hiatus following Ultra Galaxy Neo's ending. With Tsuburaya Productions going through a major restructuring in Japan, American film producer J.J. Abrams kindled a new kaiju flame over in the United States. Abrams, visiting in Tokyo with his son, stumbled upon a display of Godzilla merchandise and thought of the idea to give America a unique kaiju creation of their own. Hiring future Batman director Matt Reeves and Lost writer Drew Goddard, the trio began conceptualizing a new type of kaiju film in complete and utter secrecy with Studio Paramount. A teaser trailer was filmed using separate footage from anything in the final film and released alongside Paramount's 2007 live-action adaptation of Transformers. The teaser promised something attacking New York City, complete with a Statue of Liberty's severed head being hurled into the streets of Manhattan. No title, no cast, just a release date, 1/18/08. Paramount's approach to marketing this strange new monster movie was similar to the online hype surrounding the Blair Witch Project, another horror film made using a first-person found footage narrative technique. Online viral websites were created with cryptic photographs, and the film's characters even received official in-universe MySpace pages to flesh them out and provide clues for the film's story. The biggest hook was the fictional Japanese company of Tagruwado, famous for its frozen soft drink product Slusho. Tagruwado's construction of Chow Station, a drilling platform off the coast of Connecticut, initially seems as a means to obtain oil, but the true intention was to search for a substance the company called Seabed's Nectar. The substance contained addictive elements and was a secret ingredient in Slusho drinks. The nectar also had the side effect of causing enormous growth in organisms that consumed it raw. This information was provided in-universe by a series of whistleblower characters, culminating in more and more information about Tagruwado, Slusho, and the story behind the new film being discovered by attentive and dedicated players for months on end. And all of this information is not established in the film itself beyond small hidden references for eagle-eyed obsessives. The film, eventually given the official title Cloverfield, hit theaters on the exact cryptic date provided with the mysterious Transformers teaser. Cloverfield, without exaggeration, is one of the most important kaiju films of all time. Taking place over one fateful night, it follows a group of young New Yorkers thrust in the middle of an apocalyptic kaiju attack as they all attend a farewell party for their mutual friend Rob. Filmed in a cinema verite style reminiscent of documentary films, Cloverfield masterfully captures the pure anxieties and fears of a post-9/11 generation. The film's unusual perspective and photography style was directly inspired by home video footage of the World Trade Center attacks. References to September 11th are prevalent, with citizens fleeing enormous dust clouds following the collapse of skyscrapers, to the sheer utter confusion of said citizens in the streets following the initial explosion witnessed on apartment rooftops. Cloverfield's intentions were not to provide entertainment through large-scale destruction, but to showcase grounded, realistic disasters at a human level. The amazingly original monster is only briefly glimpsed during the film's 85-minute runtime, but what is seen is something truly unlike anything recognizable to the human eye. The monster, given the affectionate nickname of Clover by fans and identified as simply the large-scale aggressor in universe, is pure kaiju goodness in its design, composed of multiple different elements from all sorts of genuses located on Earth. The success of Cloverfield can almost certainly be attributed to its unusual and memorable viral marketing techniques, but the film's extremely high quality is also certainly a factor as well. Either way, Cloverfield will remain an essential pillar of kaiju media for the wilderness years, a time where big-budget studio releases were a rarity. Despite Cloverfield's big success, the absence of a certain central iconic kaiju figure during this time period was felt throughout the fandom. Writer-director Yoshimitsu Banno was more than aware of this sentiment and figured this downtime was the perfect opportunity to pitch his own new idea for Godzilla. Banno had been trying for decades to do a follow-up to his sole 1971 Godzilla feature, and his new idea would combine aspects of various Hedorah sequel plans. Often known by the title Godzilla 3D to the Max, the basic story saw the King of Monsters do battle with a new Hedorah-like pollution creature coined Deathla. The film would be a short, 40-minute 3D feature made specifically for the IMAX format. Despite news articles aplenty on sites like Sci-Fi Japan and promotional websites hosting and advertising the film's ever-changing release date, the film would ultimately never receive any large interest from investors, and the project died a quiet death in the late 2000s. Godzilla didn't have any success staying relevant via the movie theater screens, but the television screens at home, flanked by the latest in video game console technology, would provide a new avenue for fans to see their favorite monsters in action. Oregon-based game developer Pipeworks had been producing licensed 3D Godzilla fighting games since 2002, with their first title, Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee, being released for the Nintendo, GameCube, and Microsoft Xbox. A sequel followed suit for the Sony PlayStation 2, 2 years later, and the studio even managed to secure a spot working on the original kaiju video game franchise with Rampage: Total Destruction. But their 2007 Godzilla threequel, Godzilla Unleashed, would be the studio's most ambitious and celebrated product yet. Hyped up with an enormous kaiju roster digging deep into the archives of Toho's Menagerie, Unleashed was possibly the most important Godzilla-related product of the wilderness years. While the control scheme involved a frankly obnoxious way of playing the game, it was clearly built as a love letter to the franchise and satiated those hungry fans yearning for Godzilla content during an intense dry spell. On the film front, the number of independent and non-franchised kaiju productions made during the wilderness years was unusually large. What is there was not treated as high-value forefront entertainment, but low-budget comedic affair. One of the more shocking wilderness films was Shochiku's surprise revival of X from Outer Space star Gyulala for one more outing. Unfortunately, Monster X Strikes Back heralded the type of film most kaiju fans would encounter during the wilderness years, a kaiju movie that was almost embarrassed to be about kaiju. Monster X Strikes Back was joined by films like Death Kappa and Deep Sea Monster Raiga as painfully unfunny parodies, made clearly with knowledge of the genre's many tropes and hallmarks, but without any sincerity towards what the filmmakers were making. Many of these films would likely have been more revered if they actually took the time to make something genuine, instead of trying to make light of a genre that was already at its lowest point. As far as the kaiju fandom was concerned, new websites continued to be developed, leading to new ways for online kaiju fandom to show their love for the genre. Video sharing website YouTube gained particular prominence in the wilderness years and led to a small community growing on the website dedicated to Japanese monster fandom. Toy reviews were a pretty popular topic, as merchandise was one of the few lifelines kaiju fans had to their genre during these dark times. The premier kaiju convention G-Fest still continued despite the lack of any tentpole feature films, with more and more prominent guests such as Akira Takarada and Haruo Nakajima making the trek to Chicago to mingle with kaiju fans. August 2009 saw an extremely significant development made for the Godzilla franchise. Rumors surfaced that Legendary Pictures, the studio behind the blockbuster Dark Knight trilogy, had begun talks with Toho Studios for the production of a brand new American Godzilla adaptation, set to be released for the 2012 movie-going season. A few short months later, in March 2010, the news was officially confirmed. The long, dark, depressing wilderness years had suddenly received a clear end date. Some fans were cautious at the news, having been burned in the past by Sony's near-decade-long crusade that resulted in disappointment, but San Diego Comic-Con of that year saw this poster being released, the first ever indication of what Legendary had in store for the Monster King. It was clear the studio was very serious about this project and, most importantly, respectful towards Godzilla's roots as a character. For the elated and excited kaiju fans, it was not only an impossible dream come true, but a clear-cut sign that maybe, just maybe, their beloved genre wasn't going anywhere. With the impending release of Legendary Pictures' Godzilla reboot, fans around the world were waiting with bated breath for the rise of a new kaiju era. But kicking off this new resurgence period wasn't a new Godzilla film, but something wholly original instead. Though Legendary's Godzilla was initially planned for a 2012 release, due to production stall, it quickly received a delay to 2014. This gave ample opportunity for director Guillermo del Toro and writer Travis Beacham to unleash the kaiju opera epic Pacific Rim to awaiting genre fans in the summer of 2013. Legendary Pictures had purchased their treatment from Beacham in 2010, and the film entered production with del Toro at the helm due to the cancellation of Universal's planned adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's In the Mountains of Madness, which del Toro was slated to direct. Pacific Rim follows the story of mankind's war with invading interdimensional kaiju via a gigantic, dual-piloted mecha called Jaegers. The film explicitly refers to the monsters as kaiju, even providing an on-screen definition of the term. The Jaegers and kaiju were designed to embody their own unique style while simultaneously paying homage and tribute to the genres they were influenced by. Pacific Rim's impact on the modern kaiju fandom cannot be understated. The story's simplistic but extremely well-developed and engaging emotional beats, coupled with the beautifully rendered Jaeger and kaiju designs, movement, and combat, captured the imaginations of many an audience member. Before Pacific Rim, kaiju as a term was something of an obscurity, used only by those deeply entrenched in genre fandom. Following the movie's release, the term became more mainstream and saw widespread usage in many outlets, from online news articles and graphic novels to even influencing the name of a new Marvel Comics character. Pacific Rim even managed to grow its own small but passionate fandom, with millions of creative works shared on sites like Tumblr and DeviantArt, to even successfully crowdfunding a full-on convention celebrating the film. Pacific Rim was not a financial success in the United States, but its general critical praise and adoration from the kaiju fandom made it a perfect opening salvo for this brand new era of kaiju content. Just under a year later, it was time for the return of the king. Legendary's 2014 Godzilla reboot had seen considerable hype and marketing since its initial announcement 4 years earlier at Comic-Con. From that initial poster came a small teaser trailer, internally referred to as a mood piece by director Gareth Edwards, which spiraled into intense marketing tactics such as an on-site Godzilla exhibition at San Diego Comic-Con 2013, which allowed guests the first peek at the new look for Godzilla. Soon, toys, comic books, commercials all heralded the arrival of a new type of Godzilla for the modern age, and on May 16, 2014, America finally let loose its second try at adapting Godzilla. Godzilla 2014 is an extremely complicated film. A lot of different feelings are thrown around when discussing it among kaiju fans. Some hate it, some love it, some are indifferent. To classify this film as a character-driven drama piece would be a complete misnomer. The film is not interested in following characters that change or develop as time goes on. Its focus is more on presenting a believable disaster scenario for the world in response to an unbelievable fantasy disaster. What would a giant monster attack on a 2014 Earth look like? How would the United States military respond? In some ways, the film is styled like Cloverfield in its post-9/11 introspective look at American military response to disaster. Through the eyes of protagonist Ford Brody and his immediate family, we see the chaos and destruction that Godzilla and new original monsters, the Mutos, wreak upon the globe. Though the marketing for the film shined a heavy focus on actor Bryan Cranston's role as Brody's father, a clear attempt to cash in on the actor's popularity post-Breaking Bad, the character exits the picture at the end of the first act, a problem that continues to be identified to this very day. But regardless of its human element, Godzilla 2014's greatest triumph was in its depiction of its star character. This is an American Godzilla. It's impossible to avoid comparing this film to Sony's late 90s attempt. They got it right this time. Whatever fans thought of the quality of the film itself, the new design and portrayal of Godzilla itself was universally acclaimed. The new Godzilla exhibited all the classic elements fans associated with the character to a T, including its tenacity for combat and the iconic atomic breath. Godzilla's monstrous opponents were also wonderfully executed as well. The mating pair of massive, unidentified terrestrial organisms, or mutos for short, take clear inspiration from design philosophies like those used to create the Cloverfield monster, various elements of real-life fauna tossed into a blender to create something unrecognizable and alien to our planet's ecosystem. The release of Godzilla 2014 was a nervous time for kaiju fans. Would America embrace the character in this new adaptation in a superhero-dominated time? Or would it sink like a stone and bring the kaiju genre to near extinction once again? Thankfully, the former prevailed. Though not crushing any particular records, Godzilla was released to significant praise and plenty of cash at the ticket booth, wrangling in a solid $529 million against a $160 million budget. Though director Gareth Edwards had produced the film as an intentionally standalone piece without any enticement for a potential sequel, the film's success led Legendary to the obvious choice of optioning Toho for the rights to classic Godzilla characters for a follow-up. And, like clockwork, Legendary announced in July of 2014 that Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah would be joining Godzilla in future sequels. The United States seemed to be taking the reins for this new kaiju resurgence, but back in Japan, one of the original founding characters of the genre would finally be making a return to TV screens. 2013 saw the first new live-action Ultra series since Ultraman Mebius in 2007 with Ultraman Ginga, marking the start of a brand new era for the franchise. Ginga was the first Ultra series to put a heavy focus on the merchandise aspect of the show, featuring Ultra heroes and monsters turned into miniature figures known as Spark Dolls. Naturally, the same toys being concurrently sold in Japanese department stores nationwide. The series was not well received critically, but its second season, Ultraman Ginga S, received warmer praise. Ginga and Ginga S would be the first of the new generation series of Ultraman shows, identified primarily by their heavy inclusion of transformation devices and the usage of MacGuffins to power up the main Ultras with new abilities, forms, and weaponry. The devices would essentially be the exact same item as the toy versions sold in stores, prompting Japanese viewers to purchase and play along with the heroes on TV. Ginga S was followed by Ultraman X in 2015 and Ultraman Orb in 2016, both garnering much more appreciation from fans than their two new-gen predecessor shows. And a first of the modern age of kaiju fandom, Tsuburaya Productions simulcast both X and Orb to North American anime streaming service Crunchyroll, allowing fans overseas the opportunity to follow along with the show as it aired. After Ultraman Geed's release in 2017, however, Crunchyroll's licensing of the Ultra shows would cease, with 2018's Ultraman Rube not seeing any sort of English simulcast. But despite Rube's absence, Ultraman's international exposure was only just beginning. The kaiju genre was in a magnificent place by late 2014. A successful American Godzilla adaptation, coupled with the onslaught of new kaiju content it and fellow legendary blockbuster Pacific Rim courted, meant that there was no fear of things going sour anytime soon. And in December of 2014, a month past Godzilla's 60th birthday, Toho announced it was throwing its hat into the ring once again with a brand new Godzilla movie produced purely in Japan. In March of 2015, the directors were announced: Heisei Gamera effects head Shinji Higuchi and anime legend Hideaki Anno, who would also be handling writing duties. The stage was set for the new Japanese Godzilla, officially titled Shin Godzilla, to be produced, while Legendary's American sequel, who had lost its director in Gareth Edwards, would be pushed back from its initial 2018 date to May of 2019 while the studio rounded things up. Godzilla, for the first time in over a decade, would continue to be a prominent component of worldwide popular culture. The launch of a new big platform video game by Bandai Namco, and the addition of a Godzilla-themed room and a giant statue display head atop the Hotel Gracery in Shinjuku, Tokyo, showcased Toho's insistence on keeping Godzilla in the mainstream while the films are currently in production. 2015 also saw a small reappearance of another founding figure in kaiju history celebrating an anniversary of its own. Kadokawa, via a live stream during the New York Comic-Con, unleashed a 50th anniversary Gamera short film, showcasing the giant turtle monster combating ravenous Gyaos swarms and a brand new enemy kaiju. Though widely misreported and misinterpreted as a trailer for a new project, the short film nonetheless received a hugely positive reception, with many kaiju fans longing for the return of their favorite terrapin in some fashion. Finally, on July 29, 2016, Shin Godzilla made its debut to Japanese audiences. The response to the new film was unlike anything in the franchise's 60-year history. The film's box office revenue topped the charts for the 2016 Japanese live-action slate, and the acclaim it received from audiences was unprecedented for a Godzilla film, at least since 1954. Japanese reception primarily stemmed from the way the film took influence from the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and the subsequent Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, primarily the Japanese government's response efforts for the disaster. Shin Godzilla's complex Japanese political narrative is a far cry from past Godzilla films. emphasis is placed on realistic depictions of the Japanese decision-making process, with multiple levels of approval necessary for certain actions, and how said processes can lead to inaction or late action to the detriment of the public. Politicians at press conferences are regularly overruled by new information, and the changing of the guard leads to gridlock against impending disaster. There's honestly so much to discuss with Shin Godzilla that it could lead to its own potential documentary. Nevertheless, Shin Godzilla was so poignant in its satirical and critical elements that it struck a significant chord with Japanese audiences. The film was nominated for numerous awards, even receiving the Japan Academy Prize for Picture and Director of the Year. The massive success of Shin Godzilla was the signal flare to Toho that Godzilla, internationally and domestically, was a titan once again. And for the first time, two Godzillas could coexist. One in America under the eye of Legendary Pictures, and back home at Toho in Japan. And, as is tradition, with a new Godzilla film comes the dawn of a new kaiju era. The Reiwa era was born. Though the true Japanese Reiwa era would begin 3 years later in May of 2019, Toho themselves consider Shin Godzilla to be the first of their Reiwa assortment of projects, similar to how Godzilla 1984 is the first of the Heisei era and not vs. Biollante in 1989. The Reiwa era of kaiju is the current era we are in at the time of this production. Its most significant hallmark is that of the second kaiju boom period, soft launching with Pacific Rim in 2013 and officially a go with the success of both Godzilla 2014 and Shin Godzilla in 2016. After Legendary and Toho's two big Godzilla hits, more studios and companies began production of kaiju-related projects. Legendary themselves headlined the 2017 Kaiju March with the release of Kong Skull Island, a prequel film of sorts to the famous giant ape. Originally a project related to the Peter Jackson King Kong remake from 2005, Skull Island eventually morphed and remolded itself into a far greater cinematic accomplishment. The first entry in a brand new storytelling universe intended to cross over in the near future with the world of the 2014 Godzilla reboot, setting up a rematch of the Big Bout from 1962. Skull Island, meanwhile, was a tenacious whirlwind of a film taking place during an Apocalypse Now-inspired Vietnam era, as opposed to Depression-era 1930s New York that the Kong character was primarily associated with. Sprinkled throughout are references and plot elements connecting the Monarch organization from the 2014 Godzilla film to this new Kong story. The final end credits stinger promised a monster bash for the ages, exciting fans young and old for the next chapter in this new monsterverse. 2017's other big kaiju product was another new frontier for the Godzilla franchise, the world of anime. Produced by 3D animation giant Polygon Pictures, Toho unleashed a trilogy of complimentary side dishes for the franchise as it lie in wait for the next major live-action installment from Legendary. Godzilla, Planet of the Monsters, City on the Edge of Battle, and Planet Eater released over a 2-year period from 2017 to late 2018, both in theaters in Japan and worldwide via streaming giant Netflix. The first big-budget frontline foray into anime for Godzilla, the anime trilogy told the story of a distant future Earth under siege by a vast assortment of kaiju awakening over a period of decades, systemically demolishing the planet's living conditions and forcing humanity to abandon the planet in search of salvation among the stars. After a period of 20-ish years, humanity vows to return to Earth and finds that tens of thousands of years have passed, with the world's ecosystem totally engulfed and supported by a plant-like Godzilla. The trilogy toys with various philosophical viewpoints and discussions, especially in considering the impact of humanity and its technological advancements on the planet itself, but most of these were brushed aside by audiences due to the film's seemingly disinterest in actually wanting to use the medium of animation to its fullest potential. The Polygon anime Godzilla trilogy came and went, with many fans disregarding the projects as simple fodder to keep the Godzilla name alive in the meantime. Because of the newfound worldwide attention being placed on the kaiju genre, more than a few original kaiju productions have been released during the Reiwa era. These include big-budget action blockbuster bonanzas like Rampage, adapting the 80s video game franchise, and smaller indie features like Colossal, which use the medium of kaiju to tell more personal and intimate stories. Even in Japan, kaiju films continue to be made independent of big studios like Toho and Tsuburaya. Attack of the Giant Teacher, Monster Seafood Wars, and Kaiju Mono are just a few of the many indie kaiju films continuing to see release during the new kaiju renaissance. While the irreverent parody nature hasn't exactly subsided from these films, their release alongside more traditional and serious kaiju media makes this thing hurt just a little less. 2018 even saw the launch of a crowdfunding campaign for a remake of The Great Buddha Arrival, with an all-star list of kaiju alumni included. 2019 was, to put it lightly, a monumental year. Godzilla, King of the Monsters, the highly anticipated sequel to Legendary's 2014 reboot, was set for release in May of that year. In the year prior to its release, marketing highlighted the film's heavy focus on giant monster action, complete with brand new redesigns for Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah, the first of their Toho kin to be adapted wholesale for an American Godzilla project. While Rodan and Ghidorah stayed relatively close to their Toho namesakes in terms of design, Mothra's new fierce and battle-ready look drew a bit of side-eye from hardcore fans, but regardless, the excitement was at an all-time high. Horror director Michael Dougherty stepped in place of Gareth Edwards to direct and co-write the film, and the cast was strengthened with Kyle Chandler, Vera Farmiga, Charles Dance, and Millie Bobby Brown, among others, joining a returning Ken Watanabe and Sally Hawkins. Composer Bear McCreary announced that the original Akira Ifukube themes for Godzilla and Mothra would make their American film debut. King of the Monsters was shaping up to be one of the biggest Godzilla events of all time. Upon its release, King of the Monsters was met with difficulties. Critics were not kind to the film, lambasting its script and characters, but praising the visual style and monster sequences. Its box office prospects weren't stellar either, and the film finished its run a financial disappointment. For fans, the film remains a bit of a contentious topic. Most seem to enjoy the film, especially its approach to its kaiju, now labeled Titans in universe, especially the new personalities given to Ghidorah, Rodan, and Mothra, and the surprise appearance of a handful of new original beasts created specifically for the film. But some also had their problems with it. One of the biggest critiques revolved around the film's approach to humor and characterization, specifically the inclusion of Marvel Studios-styled groan-worthy quips and gags. Another significant detriment was its approach to the nuclear debate. The idea of Japanese character Dr. Serizawa sacrificing himself with the detonation of a nuclear weapon, specifically to help revive Godzilla, was a touching scene dramatically, but from an analytical standpoint, many found its glorification of the use of atomic weaponry to be antithetical to the overall theme of the Godzilla franchise. King of the Monsters' critical and financial failures did not stop Legendary from continuing on with its planned MonsterVerse. Godzilla vs. Kong, the long-awaited crossover project, continued production as King of the Monsters ended its theatrical run. As much of a bump in the road as King of the Monsters was for the Godzilla franchise, it nevertheless continued the kaiju genre's Reiwa period with aplomb. Ultraman continued onwards in 2019 with Ultraman Taiga, the first Reiwa-era Ultra Series show. At the end of the year, the prestigious home video label Criterion released Godzilla, the Showa-era films, a complete box set of all 15 original Showa Godzilla films in an unprecedented release. But at the end of the year, a new threat was looming, one that wouldn't just affect the world of kaiju, but everything at once. The advent of the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2019, early 2020 needs little discussion or explanation. The worldwide spread of the disease saw an unprecedented change in social interaction and global commerce, shutting down millions of businesses and altering production schedules for numerous different markets. One of the most widely covered and discussed was the theatrical distribution system. With movie theaters shuttered, many production studios sought to launch their own Netflix-like streaming services. Disney+, Paramount+, HBO Max, Peacock, you get the picture. Projects and events planned for release in 2020 were cancelled or postponed. One casualty of this was Legendary's Godzilla vs. Kong, postponed almost an entire year until March of 2021. Understandably, 2020 was a dry year for the kaiju genre. 2021 marked a turnaround from the days of the pandemic. First announced in the fall of 2020, the first ever serious anime Godzilla TV series, Godzilla Singular Point, premiered in March with a worldwide Netflix distribution marked for June. The series received generally positive reviews from fans, with it still featuring a wealth of high-concept ideas much as the Polygon trilogy of films had done, but it also knew when to draw back on those ideas in favor of a more traditional kaiju action story. The show also featured the long-awaited return of robot hero Jet Jaguar to the franchise, and a cast of colorful characters supported it through all 13 episodes. Other Godzilla kaiju made appearances as well, and the inclusion of a Godzilla who shifted through various different stages of life are clearly the work of the looming influence of Shin Godzilla on Japanese pop culture. And later that March, it finally happened. Released both to theaters where open and for 30 days on the service HBO Max, Godzilla vs. Kong finally unleashed the monster fury to many a patient kaiju fan. A more stripped-down and simplified MonsterVerse film, the movie featured two simultaneous plots, often nicknamed Team Godzilla and Team Kong, with returning characters from King of the Monsters occupying the former, and a host of new ones showing up in the latter. In between is the monster clash of the ages, Godzilla battling Kong to the death. Brutal violence and vicious action abound in each fight sequence, especially the final battle amidst a neon-lit Hong Kong backdrop. And in the worst-kept secret, even Mechagodzilla got the chance to get in on the action, showing up at the 11th hour for a 2-on-1 monster showdown. Compared to King of the Monsters, Godzilla vs. Kong was a much bigger success. Whether you owe that to its pandemic-induced factors or the star power of two giant movie icons crossing over, Godzilla vs. Kong managed to break multiple pandemic box office records and became extremely successful as a launch title on HBO Max. A sequel, naturally, was fast-tracked into development. Back in the land of Ultra, the show's 30th television series, Ultraman Z, was released in 2020 and heralded a significant change to Tsuburaya's worldwide distribution model. Through the official Ultraman YouTube channel, Z was broadcast not only alongside its TV network airings in Japan, but overseas with English subtitles as well. As this was during the darkest periods of the pandemic, it was a sign of good faith to their non-Japanese markets from Tsuburaya, who had already shown initiative the summer prior with an announcement from US company Mill Creek Entertainment, who revealed that they had secured the North American home media rights to the entire Ultraman series, and began releasing them, for the first time, on English subtitled Blu-ray that fall. Around that time, Tsuburaya also revealed that Shin Godzilla directors Hideaki Anno and Shinji Higuchi were officially producing their next reboot of a classic tokusatsu property. Shin Ultraman began production in August of 2019, but, as expected, was stalled by the COVID-19 pandemic. On television screens, Ultraman Z was followed up by Ultraman Trigger and Ultraman Decker in 2021 and 2022 respectively. These two series were produced as 25th anniversary celebrations of Ultraman Tiga and Dyna and featured new Ultras inspired by their predecessors in a sort of quasi-reboot universe. At the time of this recording, Ultraman Blazar is the current series airing on both Japanese airwaves and over the internet via Tsuburaya's official Ultraman YouTube channel, continuing to allow international fans the opportunity to follow along with no wait at all. Back to Shin, with the production stalls ceased, the film was eventually completed and released in May of 2022. Unlike Shin Godzilla, Shin Ultraman chose not to use the character as a means of political or social commentary, at least explicitly, but rather sought to bring the franchise back to its earliest roots by providing a relatively lighthearted and fun special effects fantasy fare, complete with many Easter eggs and fan-pleasing callbacks to the original 1966 series. Like Anno and Higuchi's Godzilla revival, Shin Ultraman received a warm reception and numerous accolades at the Japan Academy Prizes. At the time of recording this narration, the Reiwa era of the kaiju genre shows absolutely no signs of slowing down. Legendary's MonsterVerse continued to expand its horizons with the release of 2 television shows in 2023. Skull Island, a Netflix original anime series, debuted in June, and Monarch: Legacy of Monsters, a live-action Apple TV original drama, premiered in November. And as 2024 marches on, Godzilla and Kong are back in theaters with Godzilla and Kong: The New Empire. From Toho, the end of 2023 saw the release of Godzilla -1, a brand new standalone piece from director Takashi Yamazaki, who had previously directed the acclaimed Always Sunset on 3rd Street dramas, and had worked with the character in the second film of the series, as well as an amusement park ride in 2021. -1's release celebrated Godzilla's 70th anniversary, with the first wide-release Japanese Godzilla film since Godzilla 2000, and this decision may in fact have resulted in -1 becoming the most internationally successful Japanese Godzilla film in decades. Critical appraise was overwhelmingly positive, both domestically and overseas, and the film made many top 10 lists for the year. Accolades piled up, including a spot in the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects shortlist, a first for any Godzilla film. From the kaiju genre's resurrection in the early 2010s, to the immensely packed release calendar for the months and years ahead, the current era of kaiju history possibly rivals the legendary Showa era in terms of significance and prosperity. Though it's possible the genre could see a slowdown and eventual hibernation in the years to come, right now, the kaiju are here to stay. Over the near 100 years of its existence, the kaiju genre has grown and evolved into a global phenomenon of modern storytelling. From its humble beginnings in the early 1950s as a response to the threat of global disruption, to its evolution throughout the decades beyond as a format for continuing to inspire millions of creative minds to tell new stories with their own allegorical and fantastical connotations. Each year, the definition of kaiju mutates, growing more and more malleable with each new tale. Whether featuring atomic monsters from prehistoric pasts, silver-suited superheroes from beyond the stars, or enormous embodiments of man's folly. For its fans, for its obsessives, for its creatives, and for its originators, kaiju are, and forever will be, eternal.